Welcome to the Table of Terror. Across history, dinner wasn't just about eating. It was about survival, status, and the endless fear of etiquette failure. You might think your modern dinner parties are stressful, but imagine trying to cut your roast without angering a king. In every age, the table wasn't merely a place to eat. It was a stage, a battlefield, and a social experiment that determined who belonged, who blundered, and who got quietly judged for chewing too loudly. Forks weren't invented to help you eat, they were invented to judge you. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button. But only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. From medieval halls dripping with banners to candlelit Victorian dining rooms, the rules of the table have always been absurdly complicated. Forget eating for pleasure, and dining was an audition for respectability. One wrong movement could end friendships, marriages, or alliances. Food was political. A meal could crown a king or ruin a noble. Your spoon was as powerful as your sword and sometimes just as dangerous. Long before fine dining existed, humanity decided that eating, the most natural act we do, should be a test of character. In ancient times, sharing food meant trust and loyalty. In medieval times, it became a delicate dance of hierarchy. Every movement at the table spoke volumes about who you were. The upper classes didn't just eat to live, they ate to prove they were better than you. It wasn't enough to have food. You had to have grace while eating it, dignity while pretending you weren't starving, and the coordination of a ballet dancer when sipping soup from a shared bowl. As Europe evolved from chaotic feast halls to formal dining rooms, etiquette turned eating into theatre. The dinner table was no longer a humble spot for refueling. It became an arena of stagnant competition. The nobility could spend hours rehearsing the art of carving a roast without splattering anyone, or learning the right way to sip wine without looking like a drunk poet. Meanwhile, peasants sat cross-legged with a wooden spoon and a bowl of pottage, blissfully unaware that upstairs someone was being silently assassinated for putting their napkin in the wrong place. For nobles, mealtime was the single greatest opportunity to flaunt control. To eat calmly with restraint surrounded by abundance meant power. The trick was to appear indifferent to hunger while consuming enough calories to feed a small village. You weren't supposed to need food, you were supposed to deserve it. The higher your class, the more elaborate your rituals became. You didn't simply eat bread, you broke it symbolically. You didn't drink wine, you performed an entire choreography of toasts, nods, and grateful gestures toward your host. The goal wasn't nourishment. The goal was not to humiliate yourself, and humiliation lurked in every bite. Early etiquette manuals were full of warnings against behaviours we take for granted today. Don't lick your knife, don't slurp, don't wipe your mouth with your sleeve, don't scratch yourself, don't point your spoon like a weapon. Every rule was written because someone had done it, probably at the wrong table. What's worse, the standards changed constantly. What was polite in France was barbaric in England. What was refined in Italy could get you excommunicated in Spain. And heaven forbid you tried to impress someone by using an unfamiliar utensil. That could end a career faster than spoiled pudding. In medieval banquets, the danger was physical as much as social. People ate together in massive halls, shoulder to shoulder, using sharp knives, communal bowls, and hope. Food arrived in waves, from roast swan to eel pie, and everyone grabbed what they could before it vanished. If you were lucky, your host might give you a spoon. If not, well, fingers were nature's cutlery. The concept of personal space didn't exist, and hygiene was more of a rumour than a reality. Yet even in that chaos, there were rules. You couldn't reach too far, you couldn't speak with food in your mouth, you couldn't steal from your neighbour's trencher even if they were clearly done. It was organised madness, dinner as diplomacy. By the Renaissance, etiquette had evolved into a form of silent warfare. Nobles no longer threw bones over their shoulders. Now they quietly competed to see who could appear the most graceful under pressure. Eating slowly became a mark of refinement. Smiling too much was vulgar. Laughing at the table was nearly criminal. Guests performed elaborate rituals of bowing, tasting, and complimenting without ever admitting that the food was cold. The more rules there were, the safer the powerful felt. Etiquette became armour, a language of control, and yet the more civilized people became, the less anyone enjoyed eating. Meals that should have been joyous turned into anxiety marathons. You couldn't sneeze without risking social death. Even how you cut your bread mattered. Did you tear it by hand? Noble. Did you slice it with your knife? Barbaric. Did you butter the whole slice at once? Unforgivable. The table was full of traps, and the only way to survive was to memorize every unspoken law. Through centuries, the table evolved, but the fear stayed the same. In every era, someone was whispering about someone else's poor manners. A noble slurped too loudly. A merchant licked his fingers. A queen dared to sneeze mid-toast. And from those moments, humanity decided that dinner was never just dinner. It was theatre, diplomacy, and judgment disguised as civility. In the end, etiquette wasn't about kindness or refinement. It was about hierarchy. The powerful invented rules to prove they were more civilized than the people beneath them. Knowing which spoon to use became a way to separate the educated from the ignorant, the noble from the commoner, the refined from the repulsive. And ironically, everyone was miserable. The poor wanted to imitate the rich were terrified of looking poor, and the rest just wanted to eat in peace. So welcome to the long and glorious history of dinner, where humanity decided that eating wasn't enough. We had to make it complicated. We built an empire of manners, a social battlefield where one wrong sip could end an evening and a misplaced fork could start a war. The meal might end, but the judgment never did. Early European dining relied on trenchers of stale bread and shared bowls where hygiene met hope. It was a time when eating wasn't just a necessity, it was an adventure. Meals were part community bonding, part survival exercise, and entirely an experiment in how many people could share the same dish without starting a small war. Hygiene, of course, was optional, so was personal space. Back then, people didn't worry about catching a cold from a shared spoon. They were too busy catching everything else. Humour. Back then, double dipping wasn't rude, it was a nutritional strategy. If you were lucky enough to sit at a medieval table, the first thing you'd notice is the absence of things you now take for granted. There were no plates, no forks, and certainly no napkins. What you got instead was a trencher, a thick, flat slab of yesterday's bread that served as your all-purpose dining tool. This wasn't soft, fluffy bakery bread. It was sturdy, nearly rock solid, the kind of bread that could double as a weapon if the conversation turned political. Your trencher was your plate, your sponge, and your silent witness to whatever chaos unfolded on it. At grand feasts, servants brought trenchers to each guest and placed them before them like edible shields. Food arrived in communal dishes, stews, roasted meats, gravies and sauces, and you'd ladle a portion onto your bread plate, letting it soak up the juices until it became something halfway between a meal and a structural hazard. When you were done, you didn't take your plate to be washed. You handed it to a servant, who would then give it to the poor waiting at the gates, or sometimes, more honestly, to the hounds beneath the table. It was charity through carbohydrates. Nothing went to waste, not even your soggy plate. And yet, this system made perfect sense. Dishware was expensive, kitchens were chaotic, and water wasn't exactly trustworthy for cleaning. So bread became the eco-friendly solution of the 13th century, biodegradable, edible, and blessedly simple. The trenchers of the wealthy were made from fine white wheat, while the lower classes ate from rough rye and barley, which could double as roof insulation if dinner was cancelled. Your bread literally reflected your social status. The finer your crumb, the higher your rank. The darker your loaf, the lower your prospects. If you were eating black bread, congratulations, you were probably also the one baking it. The food itself was communal, which meant everyone at the table shared dishes, drinks, and the occasional bacterial culture. 2 or 3 diners would eat from the same bowl, spooning from the same broth, or tearing at the same hunk of meat. The idea of personal portions hadn't yet arrived. Everyone was a team player, whether they liked it or not. A nobleman might share a dish with his most trusted knight, but never with his servant, because social order had to be maintained even when you were covered in mutton grease. Eating together reinforced hierarchy. You always knew your place by where you sat and what you touched. The head of the table got the choicest cuts, the lowest-ranked diners got whatever gravity sent their way. Etiquette existed, but it was more about preventing fist fights than preserving dignity. Early medieval courtesy books read like damage control manuals. Do not put chewed bones back on the platter. Do not dip bread in sauce after biting it. Do not scratch yourself at the table. Do not pick your teeth with your knife. These weren't guidelines. They were desperate pleas from generations of traumatized hosts. And yet, people needed them. Because in a world without napkins, someone always wiped their mouth on the tablecloth. Nobles even had to be reminded not to feed their dogs from the table. A rule which many proudly ignored because, well, the dogs were usually cleaner than the guests. Cleanliness was a performance, not a reality. Before eating, bowls of rosewater were brought around for hand washing, but it was less about hygiene and more about showing you remembered to care. Guests dipped their fingers gracefully, sometimes barely touching the water, and then wiped them on a shared towel that was usually dirtier than the hands it cleaned. The idea of bacteria didn't exist, but people did have a vague sense that sharing too much might make you ill. They just assumed it was caused by sin, not saliva. The dining environment itself was a spectacle of contradictions. Great halls were smoky, loud and chaotic, filled with music, laughter, dogs, and the occasional chicken running for its life. There were no dining rooms, no quiet intimacy. Meals were social events where 100 people might eat together, and nobody had the faintest idea whose spoon had just been in the soup. At the high table, nobles dined beneath tapestries while being serenaded by musicians, while servants scurried to refill trenchers, pour ale, and remove the evidence of small disasters before anyone noticed. Down below, the lower guests sat on benches, juggling plates of meat and dodging drips from the upper class. It was the original open floor plan nightmare. Yet for all its chaos, medieval dining had warmth. There was community, laughter, and shared abundance, something that later centuries of rigid etiquette would squeeze out in favour of politeness and panic. People toasted, joked, and sang. They tore food with their hands and passed jugs of ale until everyone forgot who was supposed to be polite and who wasn't. For all their messiness, these meals united people. You might have to share a bowl of pottage with someone whose hands looked like they had been mining, but you were both in it together. A small act of equality in a world that rarely allowed it. When dinner ended, servants cleared the trenchers, swept the floors, and gathered the leftovers into baskets for redistribution. A rare act of social charity disguised as housekeeping. What had begun as a shared meal became a full-circle ritual. Food for the wealthy, scraps for the poor, bones for the dogs, and stories for everyone. So yes, the medieval table was crude, crowded, and occasionally contagious, but it had a soul. It was a place where people lived out their status, their generosity, and their hunger in full public view. And as you wipe the gravy from your fingers and hand your soaked bread plate to the servant, remember this. Civilization didn't begin when we learned to use forks. It began when we learned to share a bowl and not stab each other over it. When the fork arrived in Europe, it was condemned as decadent and devilish, while Italians embraced it eagerly. To most people, this strange, two-pronged instrument seemed like something a demon might use to roast souls, not something a dinner guest would use to politely twirl noodles. The medieval table had been perfectly chaotic for centuries. Fingers, knives, spoons, and the occasional bread trencher were all anyone needed. But then, from the glittering east, came an object so dainty, so suspiciously elegant, that it shattered Europe's idea of what it meant to eat like a Christian. Humour. Using a fork was like bringing witchcraft to dinner. The fork didn't just appear one day in a merchant's bag. It slipped into Europe's dining culture through scandal and whispers. Its roots stretched back to Byzantium, where nobles had used small golden forks as luxury items centuries before anyone in Paris or London had even heard of such a thing. The Byzantine court was the envy of Europe. Silk robes, jewelled goblets, and enough etiquette rules to make your head spin. And it was there, among those perfumed courtiers, that the fork first pricked its way into history. But it wasn't until an 11th century Byzantine princess named Theodora Dukaina married into the Venetian elite that the fork truly made headlines, and not the good kind. Theodora, a woman of refinement and apparently reckless bravery, arrived in Venice with her silks, spices, and a small golden fork she used to eat fruit. The locals were horrified. Venetians, accustomed to eating with their hands like God intended, watched in disbelief as this woman calmly speared bits of food with her tiny golden tool instead of using her fingers. The clergy quickly declared her behaviour unnatural. One priest thundered that God had already given humans natural forks, their fingers, and that to reject them was vanity against the Creator's design. When Theodora died of illness not long after, moralists smugly claimed it was divine punishment for her excessive delicacy. The message was clear: touch your food or risk eternal damnation. For centuries afterward, the fork lingered on the fringes of European society, admired by some, condemned by many, and misunderstood by all. Italians were the first to fall in love with it, partly because they had invented a problem only a fork could solve: spaghetti. Long strands of pasta required a tool more precise than fingers and more civilized than a spoon. Italians, ever the innovators of style, took to the fork with enthusiasm. By the Renaissance, the utensil had become a symbol of sophistication in Italian courts. The Duke of Milan might dine on delicate morsels of meat using a silver fork while poets recited verses beside him. But north of the Alps, the rest of Europe thought Italy had lost its mind. The French called it effeminate, the English called it unnecessary, and the clergy still muttered about divine disapproval. Even in the 16th century, the fork was viewed as a suspicious foreign fad. English travellers returning from Italy brought them home like exotic curiosities, much to the mockery of their friends. One Englishman in 1605 sneered that forks were unmanly instruments, suitable only for dainty ladies or Italian devils. Meanwhile, those same critics were still licking grease from their fingers and pretending not to notice the stains on their sleeves. Forks faced another problem. They simply didn't fit into Europe's eating habits yet. Meals were served in large communal platters, and diners helped themselves with their knives and hands. The fork didn't become practical until dining evolved into individual servings, which wouldn't happen for another century or two. Early forks also had only two tines, which made them better suited for stabbing your dinner than eating it gracefully. If you weren't careful, your roast would catapult off your plate and onto someone's lap, a social sin that even the devil himself couldn't outdo. Still, slowly, the idea caught on. Catherine de' Medici, the Italian noblewoman who became Queen of France in the 16th century, brought her beloved forks to the French court along with her perfumes, fashions, and fine manners. The French, initially horrified, eventually imitated her. After all, when royalty does something scandalous, it's only a matter of time before it becomes fashionable. Forks soon spread through aristocratic circles, not because they were useful, but because they were exclusive. Using one said, "I'm refined, wealthy, and far too important to get gravy on my fingers." Even then, adoption was slow and patchy. By the early 17th century, a nobleman might use a fork at a grand banquet, but at home he'd still eat with his hands. In England, King James I reportedly mocked fork users, calling them effeminate fools. Yet his son, Charles I, would later popularise them at court, proving that nothing converts people faster than royal hypocrisy. It took nearly 200 years for the fork to become an accepted part of dining across Europe. By the 18th century, etiquette manuals finally began to mention forks as essential tools of polite society. They were redesigned with 4 tines instead of 2, making them less dangerous and more efficient. What began as a scandalous novelty had become a standard of refinement. The fork's journey from instrument of the devil to sign of civilization was complete. And of course, once the fork became mainstream, people invented rules for using it. You couldn't just hold it any way you liked. There were proper grips, angles, and rhythms. The tool that had once liberated people from greasy fingers now chained them to a new set of social anxieties. It's funny to think that such a simple invention could cause centuries of controversy. The fork, which now sits quietly beside your plate, was once a symbol of sin, vanity, and moral decay. It was the ultimate outsider, the scandal of the table, the utensil that divided civilizations. All it wanted was to help you eat a pear without staining your sleeves. But humanity, being humanity, turned it into a moral crisis. So the next time you twirl your pasta or spear a piece of salad without judgment, remember, you're handling what was once the most controversial piece of cutlery in history. In the end, the fork didn't just change how we ate, it changed how we defined civilization itself. Royal banquets became elaborate displays of etiquette where eating was theatre and the manners meant power. To dine in the Renaissance wasn't just to eat, it was to perform. Every gesture, every bite, and every flick of the wrist was carefully choreographed to prove you were a person of refinement, wealth, and good breeding. Food was not a meal. It was a political statement, a spiritual allegory, and a flex of ridiculous proportions. In a world where nobility meant everything, even chewing had to look poetic. Humour. Chewing quietly was considered noble, choking on a roast peacock feather. Even nobler. The Renaissance dining table was the original stage. Nobles and monarchs hosted feasts that made modern banquets look like school lunches. Imagine long tables glimmering with gold platters, candles burning in silver stands, and perfumes drifting through the air thick with roast meats, spiced sauces, and the faint aroma of ego. These were not cosy affairs. They were spectacles designed to leave guests awestruck and, ideally, a little intimidated. To be invited was an honour. To survive one with dignity was an accomplishment. If the medieval feast had been about survival and shared bread trenchers, the Renaissance feast was about pageantry and perfection. Kings and dukes competed to outshine each other with the most elaborate displays of culinary art. Feasts could last hours, sometimes days. Dishes didn't just arrive, they paraded. Servants entered in carefully timed processions carrying ornate platters piled with roasted animals so extravagantly decorated they looked like living art. A peacock might be cooked, then redressed in its own iridescent feathers, wings spread as though it were about to take flight. Pastries were sculpted into castles, ships, or mythological beasts. Some dishes even moved, mechanical pies with live birds that burst out when cut open, proving that dinner wasn't complete unless something tried to escape from it. At the head of the table sat the host, the sun around which everyone else orbited. The further you were seated from this celestial being, the less you mattered. Proximity to the host was social gravity. The closer you were, the more your career prospects improved. Guests performed polite admiration, applauding dishes as though they were operas. Eating was secondary, observing the hierarchy was everything. The feast was a visual performance of power. If you dined with the elite, you were expected to embody control, composure, and appreciation, not hunger. A real Renaissance noble didn't devour food. He acknowledged it. And with these grand displays came equally grand rules. The fork, still something of a novelty in many courts, was embraced in Italy and slowly filtered through Europe's elite. Servants trained for months in the art of presentation, when to approach, how to bow, and how to remove plates silently as though they were ghosts. Guests were expected to display grace under pressure. You couldn't lean, you couldn't slouch, and you most certainly couldn't ask what something was before eating it. Refusing a dish could offend your host. Asking for more could brand you as greedy. Your only safe option was to praise every dish with vague enthusiasm and pray that the fish staring at you wasn't still moving. Conversation was an art form. Renaissance etiquette guides advised diners to speak about noble topics, poetry, philosophy, the arts, and avoid unpleasant subjects like politics, religion, or digestion. Witty banter was encouraged, but never laughter too loud, never opinions too bold. A man who told too many jokes was lowborn in spirit, while one who ate in silence was praised for his virtue. Women, of course, were expected to be delicate, composed, and to eat as though they subsisted on air and compliments. If a lady took too large a bite or spoke with her mouth full, her reputation might choke long before she did. Music often played throughout these feasts, lutes, harps, and choirs providing a constant soundtrack to the performance. The table itself was a microcosm of the Renaissance world: order, symmetry, and divine beauty. Plates were arranged geometrically, goblets spaced evenly like constellations, and the courses followed an intentional rhythm, from subtle to bold, from light to heavy, from heaven to earth. The feast was meant to mirror creation itself, a sensory version of the universe in miniature. The act of dining was as much about demonstrating divine order as it was about getting fed. And make no mistake, these feasts were expensive. A single banquet could ruin a lesser noble's finances for months. But to decline the tradition was unthinkable. Food was the ultimate weapon of display, the edible equivalent of a crown. Hosts would import spices from the East at ruinous prices, not for taste but for prestige. Saffron, cinnamon, and nutmeg were as valuable as gold. The richer your seasoning, the more powerful your image. The same went for sugar, still a rare luxury, which was moulded into sculptures, pyramids, and coats of arms. People didn't eat sugar as much as they admired it, like edible architecture. Etiquette, meanwhile, served as a filter for who truly belonged in such company. The ability to sit for hours in stiff brocade, nibble politely, and never betray discomfort was as important as birthright. These rituals weren't about refinement, they were about control. Manners were power made visible, a silent language of superiority that said, "I am too composed to hunger, too graceful to sweat, and too well bred to complain about peacock feathers in my teeth." Yet beneath all this ceremony lay the absurdity of it all. People starved in the streets while nobles performed ballets of self-restraint at tables that could feed entire villages, and still, nobody dared question it. Feasting wasn't just indulgence, it was politics. Hosting a banquet was how monarchs displayed authority, rewarded loyalty, and staged diplomacy. The dining hall was a throne room made edible. Each course announced wealth, each bite reinforced hierarchy, and every silence maintained the illusion that the entire world was as orderly as the dishes before them. So when you picture a Renaissance banquet, imagine not just the glittering silver and perfumed halls, but the anxiety simmering beneath the surface. The guests smiled, the minstrels played, and the dishes dazzled, but everyone was secretly praying they wouldn't spill something or sneeze in the wrong direction. The feast was an art form, one that demanded perfection from everyone involved, from the trembling servant balancing a pie of doves to the duke pretending he wasn't slowly suffocating in his lace collar. Because in the Renaissance, to dine was to perform, and the audience was merciless. The table was the stage, the food was the script, and the guests were both actors and critics. One wrong move and your reputation could be carved up faster than the main course. The humble napkin evolved into a weapon of social warfare, signalling refinement or ruin. It began as a simple cloth meant to keep grease off one's tunic, and somehow transformed into a battlefield of etiquette, where folding techniques could define your social class. Few objects in history have been so delicate yet so deadly. The napkin was a silent judge, sitting in your lap, waiting for you to make one false move. Humour. A misplaced napkin could destroy your reputation faster than gossip. In the early days of dining, the napkin wasn't even a napkin. It was whatever piece of fabric happened to be nearby. A sleeve, a corner of the tablecloth, or, for peasants, nothing at all. The idea of wiping one's mouth with purpose was still evolving. Medieval diners often used large communal cloths draped over the table, known as longues nappes, which everyone shared. That's right. You and your neighbours wiped your greasy fingers on the same fabric, passing the joy, and probably the germs, along. Hygiene was less an expectation and more of a distant theory. If the tablecloth looked like a battlefield by the end of the meal, that was simply a sign of a successful feast. But as Europe tiptoed into the Renaissance and dinner became an art form, people started to realise that maybe, just maybe, wiping your hands on the same cloth as 100 others wasn't the height of civilization. The individual napkin was born. At first it was huge, practically a bedsheet. Early diners wrapped themselves in it like protective armour against soup splatters and gravy accidents. Nobles used linen, while the less wealthy might settle for coarser fabrics. But soon, even the material of your napkin became a statement. Fine. Embroidered napkins said you were cultured and tasteful, rough ones said you were functional but clearly not invited to court. The true obsession, however, came with how you used the napkin. It wasn't just about wiping your mouth, it was about doing it right. You had to unfold it at the perfect time, lay it across your lap at the proper angle, and never, under any circumstances, blow your nose into it. That last rule may seem obvious now, but it was actually necessary. Some dinner guests treated their napkin like an all-purpose cleaning rag, which led to the rise of etiquette manuals politely begging people to stop. One 16th century guide warned, "He who useth his napkin as a kerchief shall dine alone thereafter." Translation: wipe your face, not your nostrils, unless you enjoy social exile. By the 17th century, napkin etiquette had become a performance art all its own. In the grand courts of France and Italy, servants would lay out elaborately folded napkins before each guest. These weren't simple rectangles, they were masterpieces of linen origami. Swans, lilies, crowns, even entire fortresses folded from fabric. A properly folded napkin was a mark of sophistication, not just for the guest, but for the household that hosted them. Some noble families had dedicated napkin folders, servants trained exclusively in the art of the fold. Their careers depended on linen geometry. One misplaced crease, and the illusion of refinement unravelled faster than the cloth itself. These folds weren't just decorative, they were symbolic. Certain designs were reserved for royalty, others denoted special occasions. In the Habsburg courts, the imperial fold, a napkin arranged in a precise pyramid-like shape, was guarded like a state secret. Legend says only a handful of servants were taught the technique, passed down through generations like Holy Scripture. When a visiting noble received such a fold at dinner, it was a silent message: you're in the presence of power. At the same time, the napkin also became a subtle social signal. How you treated it said everything about you. Drop your napkin, and you revealed yourself as clumsy or inattentive. Wipe too often, and it implied you were eating like a barbarian. Forget to use it, and people assumed you were raised by wolves. Even how you placed it at the end of the meal mattered. Leaving it crumpled was rude. Folding it neatly showed composure. The trick was to appear effortless, a paradox, given that napkin etiquette was about as natural as synchronized swimming. In noble circles, the napkin also carried coded meanings. It could silently communicate a message to servants or fellow guests. A napkin laid across the left arm meant do not disturb. One draped on the chair signalled you were returning shortly. And for servants, the napkin was a badge of status. Waiters carried them draped elegantly over the arm as a symbol of professionalism, a practice that survives in fine dining even today. The line between tool and theatre was blurred. A napkin could separate a lord from a lackey in a single fold. Of course, not everyone embraced this madness. English travellers in the 17th century mocked the French for their foppish concern with napkins, calling it proof that refinement had gone too far. Meanwhile, the French were busy inventing ever more elaborate designs, turning dinner into a textile competition. For them, beauty was discipline, and discipline was civilization. Folding your napkin properly wasn't just neat, it was moral. By the 18th century, napkins had become standard across Europe, though the obsession never really faded. As dining rooms became smaller and more intimate, the napkin evolved again, shrinking in size but growing in symbolic weight. It was the first thing placed before a guest and the last thing left behind, quiet punctuation mark to the social performance of dining. The upper classes even perfumed their napkins because nothing said luxury like wiping your face with a scent that cost more than your servant's wages. What's remarkable is how this small square of fabric came to represent centuries of anxiety about class and manners. It was never just about cleanliness. It was about control, controlling your image, your behaviour, and your standing in the eyes of others. The napkin became a mirror of civilization itself, soft, beautiful, and completely unforgiving. So next time you sit down to dinner and unfold your napkin without thinking, remember you're participating in a ritual that once terrified the aristocracy. Every crease was once a code, every fold a declaration, and every stain a scandal. The napkin may seem harmless now, but for centuries it was a trap waiting to expose your lack of grace. Because in the grand history of dining, sometimes the smallest mistake, a slip of fabric, a careless gesture, could ruin an entire reputation. After all, in the theatre of etiquette, even the linen had a starring role. Henry VIII's court turned meals into strict rituals dictating every gesture and serving order. Eating under the Tudors wasn't simply nourishment. It was an exercise in obedience, hierarchy, and theatrical precision. Every movement, every bite, every sip had meaning, and the wrong one could earn you a glare from the monarch that froze your blood faster than the wine. The Tudor table was a microcosm of royal power, where food, manners, and fear blended together in perfect politically seasoned chaos. Humour. If you sneezed at Henry's table, you might lose more than your appetite. To dine with Henry VIII was not a casual affair, it was like attending Mass, but louder, richer, and infinitely more dangerous. Meals at the Tudor court were choreographed spectacles, and etiquette was the law. The grandeur began before a single loaf was sliced. Trumpets often announced the arrival of each course, servants processed with solemn ceremony, and the entire court held its breath as dishes fit for a god were presented to the king. Henry's appetite was legendary both for food and control. He devoured banquets the way he devoured power, abundantly and with no patience for error. The court's daily meal, especially dinner, served around 11 a.m. because Tudor time made little sense, was a performance of status. The seating arrangement alone could start rumours or end friendships. Who sat nearest to the king was a matter of delicate politics, a visual chart of royal favour. Too close, and you risked drawing envy. Too far, and you risked being forgotten. At the head sat Henry, a mountain of velvet and gold, surrounded by silver platters, goblets, and an army of anxious servants trained to anticipate his every whim. The king didn't simply eat. He commanded food like a general directing troops. For everyone else, survival depended on following the script. Court etiquette books dictated everything: how to bow before sitting, how to hold a knife without appearing threatening, how to carve meat in elegant slices rather than hacking it like a peasant. Even drinking was an art. You had to rise slightly, bow your head toward the king, and sip quietly, as though hydration itself were a royal privilege. One wrong motion, too loud, too slow, too human, and you could be accused of impropriety. The Tudors didn't invent awkward dinner parties, but they certainly perfected them. Meals at Henry's court were elaborate beyond reason. Dozens of dishes would appear in waves, each one more extravagant than the last. Swans roasted and redressed in their feathers, pies filled with spiced meats, fruits imported from distant lands, and enough sugar sculptures to make a dentist weep. Servants brought each course according to strict order, and nobody untouched their food until the king had lifted his fork, or more often his hands since Henry preferred his fingers. If he paused to talk, you paused too. If he laughed, you laughed. If he coughed, you prayed it wasn't an omen. Henry's obsession with order reflected his deeper hunger for control. Food at court wasn't just sustenance, it was propaganda. The abundance on his table screamed wealth and divine favour. Every roast, every cup of wine reinforced the illusion of stability. Guests were supposed to leave thinking, the king's appetite sustains the realm. Behind the scenes, however, the kitchens were frantic. The Tudor palace employed over 200 kitchen staff to feed the royal household. The great kitchen at Hampton Court burned through entire forests of firewood just to keep up with the feasts. While the king dined in splendour, servants below endured a smoky, hellish marathon of chopping, roasting and praying that the meat wasn't underdone. And oh, the rules. The Tudors adored them. If the medieval feast had been chaotic and communal, the Tudor version was orderly and suffocating. Servants were trained to deliver food with their right hand, stand at a specific angle, and withdraw without turning their backs on the monarch. Guests had to keep both hands visible at all times, a holdover from the days when nobles were known to settle disputes mid-dinner with daggers. Even wiping your hands had to be done gracefully. Napkins, newly fashionable, were used sparingly and elegantly, as though acknowledging one's own grease were an act of vulgar honesty. Food itself carried meaning. The king's plate was a sacred zone, no one else could touch it. Tastings were mandatory before each meal, performed by trusted servants to prove the food wasn't poisoned. Eating near Henry was an honour, but also a risk. It wasn't unheard of for someone to faint under the weight of the tension, or from the smell of the kitchens below where hygiene was more myth than practice. Every Tudor meal was a study in contrast. Gold goblets and grimy kitchens, music and fear, laughter and the quiet sound of someone praying they wouldn't sneeze in the king's direction. And woe to the man who did. Sneezing, coughing, or dropping a fork could become a miniature scandal. There's a story, likely exaggerated but too perfect to ignore, that one courtier once spilled gravy near the king's robe and was dismissed from court within the week. Whether true or not, it captures the spirit of the Tudor table. Grace was everything, accidents were treason, and digestion was a privilege of the powerful. Yet, amid the fear, there was fascination. For those who survived court life, dining under Henry was unforgettable. To watch him eat was to witness monarchy in motion, the physical embodiment of indulgence, authority, and divine right. Food became theatre, and everyone played their role. The courtiers smiled, the servants trembled, and the king devoured, each mouthful reinforcing that he was not a man, but an institution. It's no wonder that even long after Henry's reign, Tudor etiquette manuals continued to multiply like rats. The obsession with proper behaviour spread through the gentry and merchants who wanted to imitate the court. Manners maketh man, they declared, but in Henry's world, manners maketh survivor. So picture yourself at that glittering, perilous table, trumpets blaring, candles flickering, and 200 eyes watching your every bite. The food is magnificent, the company distinguished, and your hands are sweating through your ruff. All you have to do is eat politely, avoid offence, and remember, if you sneeze, pray it's your last. Before cutlery became common, fingers were the primary tools of eating, and each finger came with its own etiquette. To modern sensibilities, the thought of dining with your hands might sound crude, but in earlier centuries it was considered the proper way to eat. Of course, proper didn't mean simple. The art of finger dining was an entire science, one part grace, one part dexterity, and all parts sticky. Humour. Your thumb was basically the 16th century fork, except stickier. In the age before knives, forks, and spoons filled drawers across Europe, hands were the universal utensils. Food was tactile, immediate, and personal. People didn't just eat with their hands, they ate through them, feeling the warmth of the meat, the texture of the bread, the slickness of the sauce. But just because people used their fingers didn't mean there weren't rules. In fact, there were so many rules that even a finger could betray your upbringing. Medieval and Tudor etiquette manuals, the grim instructors of table behaviour, devoted whole sections to the correct usage of fingers. Diners were expected to use only 3, the thumb, the index finger, and the middle finger, considered the honourable fingers. The ring and little fingers were viewed as too common, too base, and far too grubby for noble dining. These 3 chosen digits were like the holy trinity of manners, delicate, practical, and socially acceptable. The wrong combination, however, could make you look like a peasant trying to impersonate a lord. Of course, this wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about hierarchy. Using your fingers correctly showed you'd been raised in refinement. using all five, said, "I milk cows for a living." If you wanted to prove your breeding, you had to master the subtle choreography of hand dining. Break bread delicately with your fingertips, dip only what you intend to eat, and never, ever lick your fingers in public. The act of licking was considered grotesque, the dining equivalent of announcing your sins aloud. Instead, one was expected to use a piece of bread to discreetly wipe sauce from the fingertips, a move that was both functional and a quiet display of restraint. The tactile nature of eating also created a certain intimacy that we have since lost. Imagine a candlelit Tudor feast, the room heavy with the smell of roasted boar, ale, and beeswax, servants moving through the smoke like ghosts. The diners leaned forward over the trenches of meat and bread, dipping, tearing, and sharing. The act of eating together bound people, quite literally by touch. You could feel the meal, sense its heat, and whether you liked it or not, feel the texture of the world around you. A noble might pluck a morsel from a platter with delicate precision, while a peasant tore into bread with unapologetic hunger. Both were using their hands, but one was performing control and the other survival. Yet for all the talk of manners, hand eating could still be chaos. Communal dishes meant communal contact. Guests shared the same platters, dipping their fingers into sauces, lifting morsels of meat, and hoping that the person next to them had at least rinsed in the perfumed water before sitting down. The edu factor didn't exist. Germs weren't part of the medieval imagination. Instead, politeness came from not being visibly dirty. Before dining, servants would bring around ewers of scented water for guests to wash their hands, a ceremonial act that was as much performance as hygiene. Of course, by the end of the meal, everyone's hands looked like they'd lost a wrestling match with a roasted goose. The transition from hands to cutlery wasn't just technological, it was social. Hands were democratic, everyone had them, and everyone used them. But as the Renaissance blossomed and forks crept into noble households, the hand began to symbolize something less refined, something too human. Nobles slowly distanced themselves from the tactile world of touch, claiming that utensils represented civilization. Fingers, they said, were primitive. A gentleman was meant to lift his food, not feel it. The poor, meanwhile, continued to eat as they always had, by touch and instinct. For centuries, your method of eating was a visible sign of your class. Still, the hand retained a certain nobility, a relic of an earlier time when touch was the most honest connection to one's food. Dignified diners used it with precision, like musicians playing a complex melody. Manuals taught them how to break small pieces of bread, roll morsels neatly, and bring them to the mouth without smearing the lips. Some even advised that fingers should never travel more than halfway into the mouth, lest one appear overly familiar with their own meal. Even eating, it seemed, required emotional distance. In the Tudor court, Henry VIII himself often dined with his hands, despite owning enough silverware to arm an entire army of etiquette. He saw no contradiction. Kings could eat however they pleased. When the monarch tore into meat with gusto, courtiers pretended it was dignified. When a lesser noble did it, it was barbaric. This double standard defined the Tudor dining world. Power determined what was refined. The same act that made a peasant vulgar could make a king appear virile and majestic. It wasn't just about who used their hands, but how they did it. The nobility often dined on delicate morsels cut and served by attendants, designed to be easily handled without mess. Servants might carve the meat, remove bones, and even pre-cut bread before presenting it to their masters, ensuring that a noble's fingers remained clean, or at least convincingly so. For the lower classes, eating by hand was simply necessity. There were no servants to carve your dinner, no utensils to share. Your hand was your tool, your plate, and your proof of labour. By the late 16th century, as forks began their slow infiltration, the art of finger dining started its decline. What was once elegant became suspect. To use your hands in polite company began to seem uncivilized, a mark of rusticity. Yet even as forks spread across Europe, hands remained stubbornly loyal at the table. People resisted change. After all, Why would anyone trade the simple pleasure of tearing into warm bread or roasted fowl for a cold piece of metal? It was more than tradition, it was identity. And in a way, something was lost when we gave it up. Eating with your hands was messy, yes, but it was also intimate. An experience that connected the eater directly to the food and the people around them. Today, we talk about farm to table. Back then it was hand to mouth. So next time you pick up a chicken wing or swipe a piece of bread through sauce, remember you're honouring centuries of dining history. Long before forks tamed our tables, civilization was built with bare hands, greasy, glorious, unapologetic. To mask foul odours, diners used scented gloves, herbal arrangements, and perfumed napkins. It was the age before deodorant, plumbing or refrigeration, a time when dinner could smell like a battlefield dressed in velvet. The rich couldn't fix the problem of odour, but they could outsmart it. So rather than eliminate bad smells, they simply overwhelmed them with stronger ones. Humour. Dinner smelled like roses until the food arrived. You see, the Renaissance and early modern dining world was one big olfactory gamble. Between open sewers, unwashed bodies, and the glorious stench of animal fat simmering in kitchens the size of small villages, the air in even the finest halls could peel paint. But appearances mattered more than reality, and in polite society, smelling pleasant was as crucial as speaking well. Scents became a weapon of social survival. Perfume wasn't vanity, it was defence. Before the meal even began, aristocrats staged a small war against odour. Banquet halls were fumigated with burning herbs, rosemary, thyme, lavender, and occasionally vinegar-soaked rags tossed into the fireplace to cleanse the air. Servants laid sprigs of mint or juniper along tables to freshen the atmosphere. Guests entered not into a room, but into an herbal haze. It was less dinner and more aromatherapy session, the kind that politely ignored the smell of 200 people packed into a room where ventilation was just a rumour. The guests themselves came prepared. The Renaissance elite understood that to smell pleasant was to prove one's refinement. Perfume was a form of etiquette, an invisible signature of civility. Men rubbed scented oils into their beards and wore perfumed gloves imported from Italy and Spain, the absolute height of sophistication. These gloves, steeped in orange blossom, jasmine or civet musk, were both fashion and filtration system. A noble could raise a gloved hand to his nose when the smell of roast goose turned suspect and appear entirely polite while saving his nostrils from collapse. Women took the art of olfactory survival even forbes or further. They carried pomanders, small ornate balls filled with clove, ambergris and other fragrant materials, suspended from chains or tucked into sleeves. The pomander served two purposes. It masked foul air and let a lady look stylish while discreetly sniffing her wrist to avoid passing out from someone else's natural aroma. Some were even shaped like tiny skulls, a subtle reminder that yes, you might die from the smell of the person sitting next to you. And then there were the perfume napkins, an innovation that brought both comfort and comedy to the dining table. Nobles would dab their lips not just to remove grease, but to refresh their senses with the scent of rosewater or violet oil. The practice was part hygiene, part olfactory theatre. Guests might pause between courses, elegantly raise a perfumed napkin to their face, and pretend it was contemplation rather than survival. The more fragrant your napkin, the more cultured you appeared. Some households even had dedicated centres, servants whose sole job was to soak napkins and linens in the proper perfume for each feast. A citrus scent for summer, something musky and bold for winter, because nothing said wealth like seasonal fragrance coordination. Table decor followed the same principle. Every meal was a sensory experience designed to distract from the grim realities of human existence. Tables were strewn with garlands of herbs and flowers, and the air shimmered with the smell of crushed greenery. Rosemary was believed to purify the air and strengthen memory, while lavender kept the mood genteel. Some hosts went as far as to scatter rose petals on the floor, ensuring that every footstep released another polite reminder that civilization was winning its war against stench. barely. But despite all the effort, the results were mixed. The combination of perfumed gloves, scented linens, burning herbs, and steaming meat created a modern atmosphere that was less garden of delight and more floral stew. One chronicler of Elizabeth I's court complained that the perfume was so thick it stifled the breath. Guests would sit politely, half suffocating in the blended bouquet of roast capon and violet oil, all while pretending to be enchanted. It was quite literally the smell of luxury, expensive and unbearable in equal measure. And it wasn't just the air that needed help. Breath was another battlefield. Garlic, onions, and preserved meats did terrible things to one's mouth. And dentistry at the time was theoretical. To combat this, etiquette demanded that guests choose small sprigs of parsley or mint between courses, a habit that doubled as both deodorizer and performance. If you forgot, you risked committing one of the deadliest sins of polite society, offensive conversation. Manuals of manners warned against the corruption of the air between speaker and listener. Translation: don't breathe dragon fumes on the Duke of Norfolk. Perfume also carried meaning beyond its practical use. It was social language. Strong scents like musk and ambergris suggested confidence and masculinity. Lighter floral ones hinted at purity and grace. Even the way perfume was applied mattered. A refined man dabbed discreetly, only the vulgar drenched themselves. Ladies were expected to leave a faint trail as they passed. A fragrance of virtue, as one writer put it. Of course, reality often betrayed the poetry. After a long night of feasting, dancing, and sweating under brocade, the average noble probably smelled like equal parts wealth and regret. There's an irony in all this. While the upper classes drowned themselves in scent, the servants and cooks were the true heroes of olfactory endurance. Working in the kitchens of Hampton Court or Fontainebleau meant spending hours over open fires, surrounded by boiling fats, and inhaling the aromas of 100 different animals. The smell clung to everything: hair, clothes, even skin. No perfume on earth could erase it. The nobility may have sat in perfumed halls, but the people who made those meals possible carried the real scent of the era. Sweat, smoke, and survival. Still, for the Tudors and Renaissance elite, scent was civilization itself. Perfume separated the refined from the raw, the cultured from the crude. Smelling good meant being good, or at least pretending to be. It was proof that you had risen above the muck and meat of daily life, that your senses were as disciplined as your manners. So as the candles flickered and the roses wilted under the heat, the diners of history sat in their clouds of spice and sweetness, blissfully pretending they'd conquered the nose. Civilization, they believed, was something you could bottle, as long as you didn't sit too close to the kitchen. Placement at the table reflected rank and relevance. Sitting near the salt meant you mattered. In the grand game of dining, where forks were status symbols and napkins were moral tests, where you sat could define your entire social existence. At the great feasts of Europe, tables weren't just furniture, they were maps of power. Each seat was a coordinate on the social hierarchy, and every guest was painfully aware of exactly how close or how far they were from the centre of gravity. Humour. If you sat near the salt, you mattered. If not, you were basically table decor. To modernise, a dinner table is a rectangle, maybe a circle, something designed for convenience. To a Tudor, a Renaissance duke, or a medieval lord, it was a throne in miniature. The host's chair was the sun around which everyone else orbited. The closer you sat to that blazing centre, the more you basked in prestige. Sitting far from it, you might as well be eating in another century. There was no such thing as casual seating. Each position screamed your worth or whispered your failure. At banquets, this hierarchy played out in exquisite silent agony. The head of the table, naturally, belonged to the most important person in the room, the monarch, lord or patriarch, while the high-ranking guests clustered around them like satellites. Below them sat the lesser nobles, clerks and courtiers, each ranked according to their titles, income and current favour with whoever paid the bills, and at the very end, farthest from the royal elbow, sat the poor souls known as below the salt. Ah yes, the salt. It's hard to imagine that a condiment could determine your social value, but in the world of pre-industrial dining, salt wasn't just seasoning. It was wealth. The salt cellar, often an ornate vessel of silver or crystal, occupied pride of place at the centre of the high table, halfway between the honoured and the expendable. Those seated above the salt were considered people of consequence. Those below the salt were politely tolerated. The line of salt literally drew the boundary between the inner circle of privilege and everyone else just happy to be fed. Being seated below the salt didn't mean starvation. The food still reached you, eventually, cold and half-picked, but it did mean invisibility. Conversations rarely flowed that far down the table, and by the time dishes reached the lower ranks, the good bits were gone. You might spend the entire feast pretending to enjoy the decorative parsley while those above you feasted on roast swan and gilded pies. The distance wasn't measured in inches, it was measured in dignity. Hosts, of course, used this system to send messages. Placement wasn't random, it was deliberate diplomacy. To seat someone near you was to signal favour. To demote them to the far end of the table was a public insult delivered with exquisite politeness. Many a noble career soared or shattered based on a single seating arrangement. Courtiers watched every dinner invitation with the paranoia of spies. If your seat moved one chair closer to the salt, congratulations, you were rising. If you found yourself drifting further away, you might want to start packing your things. The anxiety didn't stop at court. Even among the gentry, seating was a matter of life and reputation. Wealthy families drafted literal seating charts for their dinner parties, balancing titles, temperaments and grudges with the care of military logistics. Seating a baronet next to a merchant could cause scandal. Placing two feuding cousins within arm's reach might result in the kind of dessert course that ended in duels. To make matters worse, etiquette required that guests act delighted wherever they were placed. The man at the foot of the table had to smile through his humiliation, even as he strained to hear the laughter of those basking in glory above the salt line. And then there was the high table, the Everest of ego. Raised on a platform, often draped in fine cloth and surrounded by candles, it was the stage for the most important guests. Sitting there wasn't about comfort, it was about visibility. Everyone could see you. Whether you looked magnificent or miserable, the high table wasn't just a place to eat, and it was a throne of judgment. You didn't slouch, you didn't fidget, and you certainly didn't spill anything. A single dropped goblet could undo years of social climbing. The lower tables, meanwhile, were the province of the overlooked, servants, musicians, and lesser attendees who formed the backdrop to the feast. They were close enough to smell the roast, but too far to taste it. Still, there were perks to being low-ranked. Less scrutiny, fewer rules, and occasionally the freedom to actually enjoy the food. Up at the high table, every bite was a performance. Down below, it was dinner. This obsession with seating went beyond practicality. It was ideology made visible. In an age obsessed with order, the table was a miniature model of the universe. The monarch or host represented the divine. The guests formed the celestial hierarchy. Even in the seating of common banquets, the logic held. Elders or employers took the head. Subordinates filled the lower ranks. The act of eating together reinforced the idea that everyone had a place, and that no one should forget it. The stress didn't end when the meal began. Throughout dinner, guests were expected to defer appropriately. You never spoke across ranks. You waited for those above you to start eating. You toasted only when permitted. Even your laughter was supposed to echo your superior's mood. It was a form of synchronized submission disguised as festivity. A smart courtier learned to read a seating plan like a prophecy. Who was rising, who was fading, who was doomed. And if you think modern seating politics are bad, the wrong place card at a wedding, the awkward end of the table at a corporate dinner, imagine living in a world where that single placement could determine your livelihood. There are accounts of nobles storming out of feasts, of duels fought over chairs, and of ambitious courtiers bribing stewards to accidentally move them one place higher. Dining wasn't just an art, it was a blood sport with better outfits. By the 17th century, seating charts became even more codified, almost militaristic. Detailed manuals explained exactly who sat where, down to the rank of cousin or in-law. The ritual survived well into later centuries, because humans, it seems, never quite stopped using dinner to measure dominance. So the next time you're placed at the wrong end of the table, take heart. At least no one's judging your value by how close you are to the salt cellar. For the Tudors, that little mound of seasoning wasn't just food, it was fate. Flattery was mandatory, and declining seconds could spark social disaster. Dining in centuries past wasn't just a matter of eating, it was a delicate performance of diplomacy, survival, and strategic compliments. If you thought today's dinner parties were tense, imagine trying to balance on the knife edge of etiquette where one wrong word could cost you your reputation, your status, or, in a royal court, possibly your head. Humour. Saying "I'm full" could be taken as your food was terrible. Congratulations, you've started a feud. In an age when hospitality was a sacred ritual and a marker of status, every dinner invitation carried enormous weight. Accepting a meal meant accepting a social contract. You would flatter your host, pretend the food was divine, and behave as though your presence was an honour to them, even though you both knew it was the other way around. The meal wasn't about nourishment, it was about negotiation. Every word was seasoning, and every smile was currency. Hosts, especially among the aristocracy, took pride in their tables with a zeal that bordered on madness. To serve bad food wasn't just embarrassing, it was a moral failure. A well-fed guest was proof of a host's virtue, wealth, and refinement. To hint that something was undercooked, oversalted, or simply unappetizing was a social offence on par with questioning their lineage. Complaining about food, even politely, was unthinkable. Guests learned early that taste buds were expendable, reputations were not. The safest course was enthusiastic exaggeration. Compliment everything, praise the meat, even if it still had feathers, admire the pie, even if it twitched. Guests were expected to heap on compliments so thickly that sincerity became irrelevant. In Tudor and Renaissance courts, eloquent flattery was practically an art form. Courtiers wrote verses about the beauty of a roast, or compared a host's venison to the divine ambrosia of Olympus. Some even rehearsed lines in advance, crafting the perfect ratio of humility and admiration. Your Grace's pudding transcends mortal understanding was the 16th century equivalent of "this is the best thing I've ever eaten." Refusing food, however, was where things got dangerous. Turning down a dish, or worse, declining seconds, was seen as a veiled insult. To say "I'm full" was to imply that the host had overfed you, that their generosity was excessive, or that their cooking was intolerable. The only polite way to refuse more was to declare that the meal was so exquisite you couldn't possibly continue for fear of spoiling perfection. The logic was absurd but necessary. The key was to make your stomach sound noble. In some households, the host personally served each guest, a practice designed to display generosity and dominance simultaneously. You didn't dare refuse what was offered, no matter how questionable it looked. If the lord of the manor spoon graced you onto your plate, you smiled and thanked him as though he had gifted you a title. Some guests even pretended to savour every bite while discreetly passing the worst bits under the table to a dog or a strategically placed napkin. Etiquette demanded loyalty, not honesty. This culture of hyper-flattery led to a sort of competitive politeness. Guests tripped over themselves to praise their host louder, more poetically and more often. At grand feasts, compliments became a sport. "Never have I tasted such divine custard," said one courtier, to which another would respond, "Indeed, the angels themselves must envy this custard." By dessert, half the room was declaring spiritual awakenings over pudding. The louder the flattery, the more likely you were to be invited back. Even the timing of your compliments mattered. Praise the food too early and you seemed insincere. Praise it too late and you risked seeming slow-witted. Ideally, you sprinkled compliments throughout the meal like herbs, frequent enough to please, but never so heavy that it became obvious. The goal was to make your host feel adored without crossing into parody. Of course, few people managed it. There's a reason so many etiquette manuals of the 16th through 18th centuries include entire sections titled "On How to Praise Without Excess." And heaven forbid you accidentally upstaged your host. Bringing a dish to share was unthinkable. It would imply their table wasn't sufficient. Even expressing too much enthusiasm could backfire, suggesting you were too hungry or worse, too easily impressed. It was a world where you could insult someone by loving their food too much. The safest route was measured delight. A gracious sigh here, a poetic compliment there, and a face that said, "I am overcome, but in the most tasteful way possible." On the host's side, things weren't easier. They were trapped in their own maze of manners. Expected to offer food repeatedly until the guest accepted, or risk appearing stingy. A proper host might insist, "Please, you must have another portion," while the guest was obligated to protest, "Oh no, I couldn't possibly," before inevitably giving in after the third insistence. This wasn't conversation, it was choreography. Everyone knew their lines, and everyone pretended it wasn't exhausting. Toasts and speeches added up another layer of pressure. Complimenting the host publicly was a must, and the best orators turned it into miniature theatre. A well-delivered toast could cement your place in the host's favour. A clumsy one could make you look like an ingrate. The great irony, of course, was that no one actually believed half of what was said. The entire ritual was an elegant charade, a social ballet performed over gravy, and even the smallest gestures were scrutinised for hidden meanings. Did you compliment the wrong dish first? Did you fail to raise your goblet at the proper moment? Did you compliment the chef too much, implying the host's glory was shared? Every choice was a risk. And because people cared about these things far more than reason should allow, dinner tables became arenas of quiet warfare fought with smiles and soufflés. What all this reveals is that the historical dinner table was less about eating and more about affirmation. The host wanted validation, the guests wanted survival. Together they maintained the delicate fiction that everything was perfect, even when the food was burnt, the wine sour, and the goose looking faintly judgmental. So the next time you find yourself at a modern dinner party and someone insists you try their new recipe, remember, you're participating in a centuries-old dance of diplomacy. You can thank your ancestors for perfecting the art of pretending that every bite is bliss. After all, saying "I'm full" once meant social suicide, wars. But at least you'd go down with excellent manners. By the 18th century, dining turned mathematical with endless forks, knives and spoons for every course. What began as simple sustenance had evolved into an intricate ritual requiring both strategy and spatial awareness. The Georgian dining table was a polished battlefield of etiquette, a glittering maze of cutlery that could terrify even the most confident diner. One wrong move and your entire reputation could be impaled alongside your roast pheasant. Humour: one fork for salad, one for fish, and one for existential despair. The Georgian era was obsessed with refinement. Britain's upper classes saw themselves as the pinnacle of civilization, and nowhere was this more visible than at the dinner table. To eat elegantly was to prove one's education, self-control, and distance from anything resembling manual labour. Where once nobles had torn into food with their hands, now they manoeuvred it with mechanical precision, as though the meal were a scientific experiment. The table itself looked like an altar to geometry, perfectly aligned plates, symmetrical arrangements of dishes, and an almost alarming number of utensils glinting in candlelight. In this new age of manners, the fork had multiplied like an invasive species. There was a fork for fish, one for meat, one for dessert, one for salad, one for oysters, one for fruit, and in some truly deranged households, one for removing crumbs from the tablecloth. Each had a specific shape, size, and social purpose. To use the wrong one wasn't just a small mistake, it was a confession of barbarism. Guests stared at their place settings the way soldiers stared at minefields, terrified of taking the wrong step. It wasn't just forks, of course. Knives and spoons joined the ranks, each designed for a distinct function. There were butter knives, fish knives, carving knives, and small ornate blades designed to delicately dissect a quail while maintaining eye contact with the hostess. Spoons came in battalions: soup spoons, dessert spoons, teaspoons, marrow spoons, serving spoons, and the particularly daunting mustard spoon, whose existence seemed designed purely to test one's patience. A proper Georgian dining table could have more silver on it than a pirate ship, and using it correctly required an advanced degree in social physics. This explosion of cutlery wasn't purely about utility, it was about identity. The Industrial Revolution had made silverware more available, but mastery of its use remained a badge of elite breeding. Middle-class families desperate to appear respectable began copying the habits of the aristocracy. Manuals of etiquette flew off the presses, promising to teach readers the proper method of dining in refined company. One particularly popular guide, published in 1772, sternly warned, "A gentleman who eats fish with a knife is unfit for polite society. No pressure." Dinner had become performance art, and the table its stage. Guests were expected to sit upright, wrists poised delicately above the table, and glide between courses with mechanical elegance. You began with the utensils on the outside and worked your way inward. A logic that everyone pretended to understand, but few actually did. Servants watched silently, ready to remove plates and replace them in perfect synchrony. If you dropped a fork, it wasn't merely clumsy, it was practically tragic. Dropping two might require social exile, and heaven forbid you mix courses. Georgian meals were served in elaborate sequences, known as removes and entremets. Each dish had its designated moment, and using the wrong utensil for the wrong time could send shockwaves through the dining room. There were even unwritten laws about how much food to take. Piling your plate high made you look greedy. Taking too little suggested distrust of the cook. Ideally, you ate enough to show gratitude, but not enough to show human appetite. In short, the perfect dinner guest was a well-dressed statue that occasionally blinked and murmured compliments. Silverware also became a kind of conversational language. The way you placed your utensils signalled your intentions. Crossing your knife and fork meant you weren't finished. Laying them parallel meant you were. A fork left prongs up in the centre of your plate signalled dissatisfaction, a dangerous move in a society where dinner invitations were a form of currency. The table, in effect, became a code, a silent dialogue of angles, gestures, and polished reflections. For hosts, silverware was power made tangible. Displaying an overwhelming arsenal of cutlery was a statement. I can afford confusion. Wealthy Georgians invested fortunes in their table settings. Some families even commissioned monogrammed silverware sets with their coats of arms, turning each fork into a weaponized family tree. Dinner wasn't just about eating well, it was about proving that you belonged to the glittering order of people who knew which spoon to use for jelly. The pressure on newcomers was enormous. Stories circulated of aspiring social climbers who froze mid-meal, staring at the silver array like condemned men awaiting a riddle. One young merchant's wife reportedly burst into tears during her first aristocratic dinner when faced with 12 separate forks. Her husband, desperate to save face, picked one at random and chose the pastry fork for soup. The silence that followed was described as historic. He was never invited again. Even conversation was shaped by the tyranny of cutlery. Holding the wrong utensil while speaking could betray nervousness. Gesturing with a fork was considered practically violent. Proper Georgians kept their hands low and their tone lower, discussing polite topics like travel, art, or the weather. Anything less dignified, like business or digestion, was strictly forbidden. The aim was to create a meal so graceful that no one noticed how hungry or uncomfortable they were. For servants, the nightmare was even worse. The footmen who set and cleared the table were expected to move with the precision of clockwork. Everything had to be symmetrical, glasses aligned by height, forks gleaming at identical angles, and plates spaced like celestial bodies. Mistakes were costly, A single crooked spoon could earn a reprimand. It was said that at grand households like Chatsworth or a Blenheim Palace, stewards would walk along the tables with rulers to ensure mathematical perfection before guests arrived. And yet, beneath the shine and symmetry, dinner remained a performance of insecurity. The more utensils appeared, the less anyone dared to act naturally. Silverware became a physical manifestation of social anxiety, a glittering reminder that refinement had become indistinguishable from fear. Every polished spoon reflected not just the candlelight, but the faces of people terrified of being caught doing something as scandalous as eating wrong. By the late 18th century, this mania reached absurd levels. One guest famously complained that dinner at a certain duke's house felt like taking an exam with cutlery. But no one rebelled. The rituals only grew stricter, the rules more arcane. After all, civilization had to be defended, even if it required 17 different forks to do it. So the next time you're confused by the number of utensils at a fancy restaurant, take comfort. You're not lost. You're Georgian. And remember, when in doubt, start from the outside and work your way in, unless you're overcome by existential despair, in which case at least you'll have the right fork for it. Toasting became a political minefield where loyalty and diplomacy clinked glasses. What started as a simple act of goodwill or raising your drink to honour someone evolved into one of the most perilous rituals of social life. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the toast had become a test of wit, allegiance, and survival. The wrong name, the wrong phrasing, or even the wrong enthusiasm could turn a pleasant dinner into a diplomatic disaster. Humour. One wrong toast and suddenly you're a traitor with excellent table manners. The idea of toasting began innocently enough. In ancient Rome and Greece, diners would raise their cups to honour the gods, their hosts, or the recently deceased, often all three in quick succession. The tradition spread across Europe, morphing into a polite social gesture. I drink to your health. But by the time of the Georgian and Enlightenment eras, toasting had transformed into a delicate, alcohol-soaked battlefield of class, politics, and ego. Every sip was a statement. Every name invoked was a declaration of loyalty. By the 18th century, dinner parties and taverns alike had adopted the ritual as essential ceremony. No feast was complete without a series of carefully performed toasts, beginning with the monarch or head of state, then proceeding through nobles, dignitaries, and finally, if the night ran long, one's drinking companions. A toast wasn't just about the clinking of glasses, it was a declaration of social order. The hierarchy extended right into the punch bowl. You toasted up the ladder, never down. But as Europe's politics grew more volatile, the toast became dangerous. In Britain, during the years of Jacobite unrest, whether you toasted the king or the king over the water could mean the difference between a night of laughter and a quiet execution for treason. The phrase "the king over the water" referred to the exiled Stuart claimant, and anyone heard using it risked arrest. Loyalists, meanwhile, raised their glasses to the reigning Hanoverian king, often with an extra splash of defiance. Entire taverns divided along lines of loyalty, their patrons whispering coded toasts while pretending to discuss the weather. It wasn't only politics that turned toasts into traps. Personal rivalries flourished under the guise of politeness. A toast could flatter, insult, or humiliate, all in a single sentence. Witty men weaponized the art, using it to expose hypocrisy or curry favour. One Georgian rake was famous for his toast: "To the health of all fair ladies, may they never mistake flattery for affection, nor affection for flattery." It earned laughter in the drawing room, but icy silence from his wife. Etiquette demanded that the host initiate the first toast, but guests were expected to reciprocate, ideally with eloquence. Manuals on manners included entire sections devoted to the proper structure of a toast. It was not enough to simply raise your glass. You had to speak with charm, brevity, and precision. The best toasters were celebrated like poets. The worst were pitied like politicians. In polite society, a weak toast could ruin your image as surely as spilling soup. Alcohol, naturally, played a starring role. The more people toasted, the more they drank, and the more dangerous the ritual became. In taverns and gentlemen's clubs, toasting often escalated into full-blown competitions. Men prided themselves on their endurance, drinking to every saint, sweetheart and royal cousin until the room spun and alliances blurred. One 18th century diarist described an evening in which guests toasted so long that the candles expired before the conversation did. By the end, no one remembered what was being celebrated, only that someone had been deeply offended. Women too became objects of toasts, though rarely participants. In mixed company, men often toasted the ladies present, accompanied by bows and smiles that varied between gallant and creepy. A truly fashionable gentleman could coin a toast so flattering that it might earn him a blush. An unskilled one risked a duel. Toasts to women became coded performances of admiration, desire, and occasionally scandal. In the rowdier drinking clubs, these odes devolved into bawdy verses shouted across smoky tables, immortalizing names that polite society preferred to forget. The political tension of the toast reached its absurd peak in the late 18th century, when revolutionary fervour swept Europe. In France, the very act of raising a glass could mark you as a royalist or a republican, depending on how you did it. Some Jacobins swore to never toast the king's health, but instead the downfall of tyrants. In Britain, radicals toasted the rights of man, while loyalists toasted the death of sedition. What began as camaraderie turned into coded warfare. Glasses shattered, tempers flared, and occasionally so did tempers into literal duels. It was possible to enter a dinner party as a guest and leave as an exile, or in some tragic cases, a corpse. The etiquette of the toast only grew stricter as the centuries passed. You had to stand while toasting, raise your glass to the right height, too low and it was rude, too high and it was boastful, and never drink before the person being toasted had done so. Failing to drain your cup completely was seen as cowardice, a sign that your loyalty was as thin as your wine. And if you toasted yourself, social suicide. Even narcissism had rules. There was, of course, an art to recovering from a disastrous toast. The best solution was humour, the self-deprecating kind that made your blunder seem intentional. A famous diplomat once flubbed his toast to the French ambassador by accidentally saying, "To the friendship of France and its eternal submission." The silence that followed was glacial, until he added, "To logic, which deserts us when we most need her." Laughter erupted, and his career survived another night. By the Victorian era, the tradition mellowed but remained essential. Formal banquets were choreographed around toasts, to the Queen, to the armed forces, to absent friends, to the prosperity of the empire. Each required its own script, its own rhythm. But even as the risk of execution faded, the anxiety never did. The toast continued to embody everything terrifying about historical dining. The expectation to speak perfectly, drink gracefully, and mean absolutely none of it. So when you raise your glass today, take a moment to appreciate the centuries of panic that went into that simple gesture. Toasting may look like a harmless ritual, but it once decided fates, toppled friendships, and crowned fools. It wasn't just about who you toasted, it was about who dared to drink with you afterward. Because in the grand theatre of etiquette, nothing was ever as dangerous as sincerity with a smile, especially when accompanied by a full glass. Servants enforced and observed the rules, silently judging their masters every misstep. For all the pomp and pageantry of history's grand dining rituals, the people who actually made them happen rarely sat at the table. They moved around it, quiet, invisible, indispensable. They carried the food, refilled the wine, cleared the plates, and most importantly, witnessed everything. In the great theatre of etiquette, the guests might have been the actors, but the servants were the stage managers, the ones who knew every cue, caught every mistake, and privately graded the performance. Humour. The real judges weren't your peers, they were the servants rolling their eyes behind you. To be a servant in a noble household during the Georgian or Victorian eras was to live in a world of invisible warfare. The line between respect and resentment was paper thin. You had to make yourself unseen, unheard, and unremarkable, while somehow performing tasks that required impossible grace and precision. You were expected to anticipate a need before it was spoken, pour wine without spilling a drop, and remove a dish without rattling a single fork. Any error could mark you for life, or at least for unemployment. And yet, even in their garments, servants held an unspoken power. They saw the mighty stripped of their illusions the moment the last guest left and the candlelight dimmed. The higher the rank of the household, the more elaborate the hierarchy of servants became. In grand estates, dining was run like a military operation. At the top stood the butler, commander of the table, custodian of the silver, and silent architect of dignity. Beneath him were the footmen, the liveried soldiers of etiquette, chosen for their height, posture, and ability to look elegant while doing absolutely everything. Below them came the maids, the scullery workers, the kitchen boys, an entire invisible army whose collective goal was to make their masters appear effortlessly civilized. Every meal was a test of coordination and nerves. The butler, in particular, was the ultimate arbiter of respectability. His calm presence embodied the household's reputation. A single raised eyebrow from him could communicate volumes. If a guest slurped soup too loudly or used the wrong fork, he'd remain perfectly still, but his silence carried judgment sharp enough to slice glass. The host might never notice the mistake, but the servants always did, and they remembered. In a world obsessed with appearances, servants were the keepers of reality. They knew which noble cheated at cards, which lady reused her perfume bottles, and which baronet drank himself senseless after every dignified banquet. Below stairs, the gossip flowed like gravy. After the last plate was cleared, servants would retreat to their quarters and trade stories with the enthusiasm of journalists at a scandal sheet. The aristocracy may have written history, but servants narrated it. His lordship spilled the custard again, one might sigh. Her ladyship's jewels nearly fell into the soup, another would laugh. Behind every polished facade was an army of weary witnesses holding the receipts. The greatest irony of all was that while nobles obsessed over impressing one another, it was often the servants who knew how ridiculous they truly looked. Still, servants weren't merely passive observers, they were enforcers of etiquette in their own right. The grand dining experience depended on their mastery of timing, silence, and precision. The perfect servant was a ghost, always present, never intrusive. They had to refill wine glasses without brushing sleeves, remove plates without interrupting conversation, and step exactly the right distance behind their master's chair. The ideal footman could glide across a room carrying a heavy tray without making a sound, as if the laws of gravity had agreed to be polite. Their movements became an art form, a kind of dance choreographed to the rhythm of clinking silver and murmured compliments. Of course, this silent discipline came at a cost. Servants lived by the clock and the bell, constantly at the mercy of whims. They rose before dawn and retired long after their masters had finished congratulating themselves on their graciousness. Dinner might end for the guests at midnight, but for the staff it often stretched into the small hours, polishing, cleaning, resetting the battlefield for the next round of social combat. And yet many took pride in their work. The perfect dinner was a masterpiece of invisible labour, and for a servant it was the one arena where excellence, however unacknowledged, was its own reward. Etiquette manuals written for the upper classes rarely acknowledged this world of hidden labour. They instructed nobles on how to summon servants discreetly with a bell or a glance, but never addressed what those servants actually endured to make it all work. For example, a Victorian hostess might read that her maid should pour the tea with grace and quiet dignity, as though dignity was something that came free with wages of sixpence a week. The truth was that the perfection of polite society was built on exhaustion, and everyone downstairs knew it. Still, servants had their revenge, subtle but satisfying. The smallest acts of quiet rebellion could feel glorious. A slightly lukewarm dish served to a pompous guest, a faintly raised eyebrow at an overzealous flirt, or the simple pleasure of watching a lord nearly choke on his own arrogance. It wasn't mutiny exactly, but it was moral balance. Servants lived among hypocrisy daily. Humour was their shield. Even more fascinating was how much etiquette depended on them. A host could be ruined by an incompetent servant. If a butler dropped a dish, the shame fell on the master. If a footman poured the wrong wine, it was the household's reputation that suffered. Servants were both the scapegoats and the saviours of polite dining. In their hands, literally, rested the illusion of order that defined an entire social class. By the 19th century, this dynamic reached its peak in the great English country houses, where hundreds of servants kept life running smoothly while remaining invisible. Bells rang constantly from upstairs rooms, signals that sent footmen racing through hidden corridors. Guests marvelled at how effortlessly everything flowed, never realising that beneath their feet, chaos reigned in a ballet of precision and panic. The grace of the upper class was, in truth, a carefully maintained illusion powered by exhaustion and practice. And yet, in their quiet way, servants understood etiquette better than anyone. They knew when to speak and when to remain silent, when to act and when to vanish. They had to. It was survival. They were both the enforcers and the silent critics of a world obsessed with appearances. Their discretion kept secrets, but their knowing glances told the truth. So the next time you imagine a grand Georgian dinner or a Tudor feast, remember that while nobles preened and courtiers plotted, it was the servants who truly ruled the room. They polished the silver, kept the wine flowing, and silently ensured that civilization didn't collapse into spilled soup and scandal. They didn't need titles or fortune. They had something far more dangerous. They saw everything. Dinner conversation was a tightrope of politeness, where taboo topics were fatal. In a world where etiquette ruled with the precision of a ticking clock, words were as dangerous as knives and just as sharp. To speak was to risk offence. To stay silent was to risk invisibility. Guests balanced their phrases like acrobats, praying not to slip into scandal. Humour. If you mentioned bowel movements, you were socially exiled, but everyone was secretly constipated anyway. At grand banquets and genteel suppers, conversation wasn't about communication, it was about choreography. You were expected to talk just enough with just the right tone, to the right people, about the right things. The list of forbidden topics was long, and the list of safe ones painfully short. Politics, religion, and money were instant death sentences. Medicine was considered vulgar, death too gloomy, and personal complaints unthinkable. Even praising the food too enthusiastically could make you sound like you'd never eaten before. The ideal dinner guest was eloquent, charming, and utterly devoid of opinions. The art of table talk evolved alongside etiquette itself. In medieval halls, conversation was loud, boisterous, and often accompanied by belching contests and gossip shouted over minstrels. But by the Georgian and Victorian eras, refinement had taken the fun out of noise. Conversation became a subtle performance, an invisible duel of intellect and restraint. The louder your voice, the lower your breeding. A polite diner spoke with measured wit, and always at the volume of a well-bred ghost. Hosts took conversation seriously. It was part of their reputation. A dinner could be judged not by the quality of its wine, but by the sparkle of its dialogue. The best hosts carefully curated their guest lists like museum exhibits, balancing personalities to prevent chaos. The talkative was seated beside the quiet, the witty beside the dull, the scandalous beside the deaf. But even the best plans could fail. One ill-timed remark could turn a charming evening into a silent graveyard of forced smiles and clinking forks. Manuals of etiquette dedicated entire sections to the management of discourse at table. They warned readers against being too earnest, too familiar, or too self-conceited. The golden rule was to speak for others' pleasure, not your own. A well-mannered diner was meant to float through topics like a butterfly, briefly, gracefully, and without landing long enough to sting. One 18th century guide even advised, "If one must speak of one's travels, let it not exceed the duration of a boiled egg." Apparently anything longer risked indigestion, social or otherwise. But the problem with avoiding all meaningful topics is that it leaves very little to say. The result was generations of dinner guests trapped in endless loops of small talk. Weather, theatre, the quality of the candles, anything safe, harmless, and crushingly dull. Some witty souls tried to inject humour, but even that came with danger. Sarcasm could be misread, jokes could offend, and laughter too loud was practically a crime. To laugh freely was to reveal emotion, and revealing emotion was about as acceptable as eating soup from the tureen. Politics, of course, was the ultimate conversational landmine. In 18th century England, dinner could easily turn into ideological warfare. One guest's toast to the king could be another's cue for outrage. Across Europe, political loyalties divided tables as sharply as they divided nations. In France, before the Revolution, noble hosts banned the subject entirely, only for guests to whisper about it anyway, half the table pretending not to hear, while silently cataloguing who said what. When revolutions came, it was often the same dinner companions who later denounced each other to the authorities. Talk about a bad aftertaste. Religion was equally perilous, piety was expected, but discussion of doctrine was gauche. Mentioning sermons was acceptable only if one avoided any actual beliefs. The goal was to sound moral without sounding specific, a feat that required verbal acrobatics and often deep dishonesty. One guest might murmur, "The bishop spoke most divinely," to which another would reply, "Indeed, the very sound of his voice inspires reflection," all while thinking about pudding. Then there was the eternal nightmare of digestion, a topic absolutely banned, even though most people spent dinner either enduring or anticipating its consequences. In polite society, bodies were theoretical. One was never supposed to acknowledge that food had to go somewhere. Discussing it was an instant exile from civility. Guests would nod through courses of heavily spiced meats, rich gravies, and alarming quantities of wine, pretending that no internal rebellion was brewing. Decorum demanded composure, even as everyone secretly envied the servants who could escape to breathe. Flirting, too, had its rules. Courtly conversation was full of veiled compliments and carefully moderated charm. A gentleman could praise a lady's wit, but not her beauty, unless he was her husband, in which case no one wanted to hear it. A lady could tease, but not too boldly, lest she be accused of impropriety. The dinner table was a chessboard of glances and phrases, where every move carried meaning. A misplaced compliment could start a scandal faster than spilled wine. For those lacking natural wit, the safest route was to imitate others. Guests would parrot fashionable phrases from books or newspapers, nodding sagely and pretending to have opinions they didn't understand. Some would memorize conversation starters in advance, a sort of verbal armour against silence. "Did you hear about the comet?" was a classic fallback, neutral, mildly intellectual, and unlikely to offend. The real tragedy was that after several courses and several glasses of claret, everyone began repeating each other anyway. The illusion of elegance was maintained, but the content was pure static. Of course, not everyone followed the rules. Every era had its conversational rebels, the ones who couldn't resist slipping in a forbidden joke or an unpopular truth. Voltaire scandalised French salons by actually arguing at dinner. Samuel Johnson bulldozed Georgian hosts with his booming voice and brutal honesty. These men broke the rules and became legends, but for ordinary mortals, rebellion came with consequences. One woman in Regency England was blacklisted from half of London after mentioning childbirth at supper. Another man was quietly dropped from every guest list for referring to taxation. The line between boldness and banishment was perilously thin. Conversation, in essence, was a weapon disguised as a courtesy. It was how alliances were made, reputations destroyed, and marriages negotiated. A single remark could raise your standing or end your prospects. People learned to polish their sentences until they shone like silver, but they also learned to use them like daggers. Words were the one luxury every class could afford, and the higher you climbed, the sharper they had to be. So the next time you're trapped at a dull dinner, nodding through meaningless small talk about weather and wine, take comfort. You're participating in an ancient survival ritual. The good news? You probably won't get executed for mentioning politics. The bad news? Someone's still judging you for how loudly you chew. Napkin folding evolved into a coded art form, denoting rank and taste. What began as a practical cloth for wiping one's hands became a subtle system of social signalling, a soft, starched language of status. In the age of etiquette, your napkin didn't just sit on your lap. It announced your place in the world. Humour. Your swan-shaped napkin said, "I'm rich." Your crumpled one said, "I have anxiety." By the 17th and 18th centuries, the napkin had graduated from humble linen to the centrepiece of civility. In earlier centuries, it had served the simple purpose of catching gravy and saving sleeves. But once the Renaissance obsession with refinement spread across Europe, even the napkin had to evolve, from tool to performance. The wealthy realised that a plain folded square wasn't nearly ostentatious enough, and thus an entire discipline was born. The noble art of folding napkins into shapes so elaborate that eating became secondary to admiring them. In the courts of Europe, particularly France, Germany and Austria, napkin folding became an expression of control and class. The ability to fold a napkin into a peacock or fleur-de-lis wasn't just decoration. It was proof that your household employed servants with patience, dexterity, and a tragic amount of free time. Manuals appeared teaching the geometry of folds, the proper starching techniques, and which designs were suitable for which occasions. A royal banquet might require phoenixes and crowns, a noble wedding, hearts and roses. A mere dinner with guests of modest rank might only warrant the modest bishop's hat. Servants were the hidden artists behind these masterpieces, the best of them trained for months, even years, mastering the subtleties of fabric manipulation. Their creations were not mere napkins, they were textile sculptures. Some were folded so tightly that they stood upright like towers, others spread like wings or petals across the table. A successful design was meant to awe without collapsing, a feat made all the more impressive considering that the slightest draught could turn a swan into a pancake. The greatest folding dynasty of them all belonged to the Habsburg Empire. At the court of Vienna, the imperial napkin fold was treated as a state secret. Only a few trusted servants were permitted to learn it, sworn to secrecy as though it were a military code. The design itself, resembling an intricate double-pleated crown, could only be used for the emperor and his closest kin. Legend claimed that to this day the imperial fold is still taught to palace staff under confidentiality, a 300-year-old linen conspiracy that outlasted empires. For those outside the royal circle, napkin folding became a mark of social aspiration. The upper middle classes, desperate to mimic aristocratic habits, attempted their own versions, with mixed success. Households across Britain and France produced dinner tables that looked like amateur origami exhibitions. Guests smiled politely while trying to avoid knocking over the linen swans that guarded their plates. For the ambitious but untrained, folding etiquette guides became the self-help books of their age. One particularly popular 18th century manual, The Delight of the Napkin, promised to elevate a table from ordinary to imperial. It came complete with diagrams which mostly resembled architectural blueprints for people who had never seen fabric before. The symbolism of napkin shapes soon became part of dinner's secret vocabulary. A fan suggested elegance and hospitality. A rose signified romantic intention. A fish, ironically, was often used at meat courses because it showed you were cultured enough to ignore logic. Even the colour and material carried meaning. Pure white linen was the ultimate standard, a sign of wealth, cleanliness, and moral virtue. Coloured napkins were tolerated, but patterned ones were considered suspiciously continental, meaning flamboyant. To a British diner, a printed napkin suggested emotional instability, and woe betide anyone who folded incorrectly. At grand feasts, it was expected that guests would know how to unfold their napkin gracefully, never flapping it open like a bedsheet, never letting it touch the floor, and certainly never tucking it into their collar like a commoner eating stew. The proper gesture was a controlled flick of the wrist, laying the napkin neatly across one's lap without disturbing the elaborate centerpiece before you. To unfold too early was rude, To wait too long suggested ignorance. There was even an unwritten rule that you should follow the host's lead, a ritualistic synchrony of linen that could make the most anxious guest break into a sweat. Napkins also became tools of subtle communication between diners. In some circles, folding and placement were used to send coded signals. A napkin left neatly folded on the table meant, "I shall return." A crumpled one indicated, "I am finished." A napkin thrown onto the chair, scandalous, hinted at dissatisfaction. Servants learned to interpret these gestures with precision, knowing when to bring the next course or occasionally when to bring another bottle to soothe a guest's wounded pride. As table manners grew more complicated, the napkin became an instrument of social survival. For all its delicate beauty, it carried the weight of expectation. Guests would rehearse how to use it correctly before important dinners, terrified of committing a faux pas. Folding the napkin improperly could mark you as unrefined. Failing to notice a servant's intricate creation might brand you as ungrateful. It was an object meant to protect you from stains, yet capable of staining your reputation. Even the simple act of returning the napkin at the end of a meal had its own code. Leaving it neatly folded suggested restraint and discipline. Leaving it loosely draped indicated comfort and satisfaction. Shoving it into a goblet, the historical equivalent of rage quitting, was reserved for those who had given up on dignity entirely. For servants, these end-of-meal napkin configurations were a silent performance review. The linen told them everything they needed to know about how the evening had gone. By the 19th century, the obsession with folding began to fade, replaced by the rising popularity of ironed, perfectly flat napkins. Industrial modernity was allergic to whimsy. Still, in grand hotels and royal palaces, the tradition survived, each crease a ghostly echo of centuries when the shape of your napkin could make or break your standing. It's funny to think that in the theatre of etiquette, something as soft and harmless as linen could wield such authority. But that was the paradoxes of polite society. The smaller the detail, the greater the danger. The napkin might have been a servant's creation, but it was the diner's burden, a white flag of civility fluttering over a battlefield of social anxiety. So next time you sit down and see a neatly folded napkin waiting for you, take a moment to appreciate it. It's not just a piece of cloth, it's a centuries-old test of composure, a message from history that says, "Welcome, try not to ruin everything in the first 10 seconds." Victorians turned dining into an endurance test of manuals, manners, and mental breakdowns. Dinner was no longer about pleasure, it was about precision. Every gesture, every pause, every flick of the wrist was measured against an invisible code of conduct that no one fully understood, but everyone feared. To eat in Victorian England was to perform under constant surveillance, a symphony of spoons, silence, and suppressed terror. Humour. Victorian dinner was less about eating and more about surviving the cutlery choreography. By the mid-19th century, etiquette had metastasized into an entire industry. Manuals appeared faster than puddings at a railway hotel, each one promising salvation from social ruin. The Complete Guide to Polite Behaviour at Table, the Lady's Book of Decorum, hints for the unpolished. The message was clear: the fork was your future, and one wrong move could end it. Manners became moral law. Politeness wasn't just about looking refined, it was proof that you were civilised, respectable, and most importantly not working class. The Victorian dining table was a stage set for nervous breakdowns. Hosts obsessed over table arrangements like generals planning a siege. Guests, meanwhile, faced the terrifying ordeal of using an expanding arsenal of utensils, each designed for a specific purpose. There were asparagus tongs, fish forks, grape scissors, and oyster spoons, because heaven forbid you used the wrong implement and accidentally signalled you were born in the wrong neighbourhood. A newcomer to high society once confessed that her first dinner felt less like eating and more like taking an examination with silver pens, but the real test came before the first bite. A proper Victorian dinner party began with an arrival ritual that could make or break your night. You had to be announced at the door by the butler, enter with confidence, greet the host in the correct order, and know precisely where to sit, all before the soup arrived. Seating plans were arranged with ruthless calculation. Important guests near the host, lesser mortals drifting toward the decorative ferns. And if you thought you could swap seats for comfort, think again. The hostess had spent hours orchestrating that arrangement to balance personalities, titles, and marital tensions. You weren't just dining, you were part of her living artwork. Once seated, the anxiety began. Napkin placement was a moral statement. Conversation required gymnastic precision, clever but not boastful, charming but not flirty, witty but never controversial. The Victorians prided themselves on being proper, which meant never showing too much enthusiasm for anything, including food. You were meant to eat with the calm detachment of someone spiritually above digestion. Enjoyment was vulgar, restraint was holy. And then came the food, endless courses, each with its own choreography. Soup first, of course, sipped silently from the edge of the spoon, always moving away from the mouth, never toward it, to avoid splashing your chin or your reputation. Fish followed, but only with the fish knife, never the meat knife, lest someone faint from horror. Meats came next, served with sides so numerous that your plate looked like a topographical map. Vegetables were taken in moderation. Potatoes were eaten delicately, not mashed, and certainly not stabbed. Dessert was a final exam in miniature form. You couldn't eat fruit by hand, that would be barbaric. Instead, you used a knife and fork to peel, slice, and consume even the smallest grapes, one precise segment at a time. Watching a Victorian lady dissect a strawberry with surgical precision was both mesmerising and deeply unsettling. The motto of the age seemed to be, if it's edible, complicate it. Silence, however, was just as dangerous as speech. Dinner conversation had its own rulebook, policed as tightly as the meal itself. Guests were expected to discuss pleasant, inoffensive topics, art, music, the weather, travel, but not too exotic, and mutual acquaintances, but not gossip. Anything else was scandalous. Politics, dangerous, religion, exclusive, illness, absolutely not. Humour that involved bodily functions. A one-way ticket to social Siberia. Everyone smiled politely while praying someone else would say something to fill the void. For the servants, this was chaos disguised as order. Beneath the candle-lit calm, the butlers and maids were waging a logistical war. Each dish had to be presented at the perfect temperature, at the exact moment, without interrupting the delicate rhythm of conversation. The service style, à la Russe, imported from France, required that food be served in sequential courses rather than all at once, which meant the staff sprinted like Olympic athletes between dining room and kitchen while maintaining an expression of serene invisibility. Guests floated serenely above the chaos, unaware that one mistimed course could unravel the illusion entirely. The Victorians also invented an entirely new genre of guilt, dining as moral performance. How one ate became a reflection of one's soul. To chew too loudly suggested gluttony, to reach too quickly hinted at greed. Even appetite was a moral issue. Women were expected to eat lightly lest they appear animalistic. Men could eat heartily, but only with gentlemanly decorum. Children, if present, were warned that any crumb dropped would shame the family for generations. The dinner table became a microcosm of Victorian hypocrisy, all restraint and appearance, hiding a storm of repression beneath. Everyone pretended to be serene, but the tension was palpable. Behind those lace collars and polished manners were people terrified of making eye contact with the wrong spoon. The manuals that promised social salvation only made things worse. They contradicted one another constantly. One said you must finish everything on your plate. Another said leaving a small portion was polite. Some even debated the morality of finger bowls. Were they tools of refinement or scandalous hints that one's fingers might ever be dirty? And yet, for all its absurdity, the Victorian dinner party was mesmerising. It was theatre, elaborate, exhausting and beautiful in its madness. The glitter of chandeliers, the the murmur of conversation, the soft rustle of satin gowns, and the glint of silver under candlelight created an atmosphere of fragile perfection. Everyone played their part. The gracious host, the clever guest, the silent servant, all united in the shared terror of spilling gravy on white linen. When the meal finally ended, guests retreated to drawing rooms, men to cigars, women to tea, and everyone to collective relief. Survival was victory. The next day, society pages would praise the evening's elegance, never mentioning the man who dropped his fork or the woman who fainted from wearing a corset through 12 courses. History remembers Victorian etiquette as the golden age of manners, but for those who lived it, it was more. Resting elbows on the table became symbolic of rebellion and moral decay. It sounds absurd today that two simple joints could provoke such outrage, but in the age of etiquette, your elbows weren't just body parts, they were moral statements. To the Victorians, Georgians, and even their nervous Tudor ancestors, elbows represented everything impolite, unrestrained, and dangerously human about the dining experience. Humour. Your elbows weren't just rude, they were acts of rebellion. For centuries, the dining table was considered a sacred space. Not quite a church altar, but not far off either. Every inch of it represented order, civility, and hierarchy. And nothing threatened that fragile ecosystem more than the sudden intrusion of an elbow. Placing them on the table suggested laziness, carelessness, or even arrogance. It broke the invisible barrier between the upright poise of a civilized diner and the hunched animality of a glutton. The elbow was the enemy of posture, and posture, in turn, was the foundation of respectability. In medieval feasts, before etiquette grew its hundreds of pages of rules, people leaned freely. Elbows, arms, sometimes even entire torsos spread across the table as they reached for meat or shared trenchers. But once the Renaissance introduced refinement and furniture with narrower surfaces, physical sprawl became socially hazardous. The elbow's days were numbered. By the 17th century, courtesy books had begun to issue clear warnings. "Keep not thy elbows upon the board, as if thou wert weary of thy company," wrote one English moralist in 1620. The reasoning was clear. Elbows signalled boredom, and boredom at dinner implied that your host, or worse, your social better, had failed to amuse you. During the Georgian era, this minor rule of posture hardened into gospel. Society had developed a near-theological devotion to bodily control. Proper dining posture was a visual shorthand for your soul's refinement. The ideal diner sat straight-backed, shoulders square, wrists relaxed just above the edge of the table, and elbows nowhere in sight. Manuals described the correct position in painful detail. Some even illustrated it, like anatomical diagrams of virtue. To rest your elbows was to collapse morally. The table was not for leaning, it was a mirror reflecting your discipline. The Victorians, naturally, took this to operatic extremes. Their entire social universe was a fortress of restraint, and elbows were contraband. Etiquette books warned that resting them, even briefly, risked announcing yourself as vulgar or common or untrustworthy. Children were drilled in posture from an early age, balancing books on their heads or sitting at dinner under the gaze of parents who enforced uprightness as though civilization depended on it, and in their minds it did. One particularly grim 19th century guide advised, "Let the elbows hang modestly by the side, for they are the first sign of sloth, and sloth is sin." Imagine getting condemned to eternal damnation because you got tired during soup. This paranoia about elbows wasn't just about manners, it was about class. The working poor ate at rough tables or from their laps, where leaning forward was unavoidable. To sit rigidly upright for hours was a luxury reserved for those who didn't actually have to work. Thus, avoiding elbows became a performance of leisure, a way to prove that you were not one of the people whose backs carried the world. In a sense, it was the posture of privilege. The upper classes had the time and muscle endurance to sit perfectly still while servants brought them everything. To be able to not lean was the ultimate flex, and yet even among the elite, elbows were a persistent temptation. The dinner table was long, The courses many, and the conversations dull. People were expected to maintain grace through up to 12 courses of food, punctuated by long toasts, whispered gossip, and the slow suffocation of too tight corsets. Eventually someone cracked. One discreet elbow would sneak up onto the table's edge, a quiet act of rebellion, a soft mutiny against propriety. Etiquette manuals anticipated this moment of weakness with moralistic flair. The elbow upon the table proclaims a soul that hath lost its patience. It wasn't just a breach of manners, it was practically a confession. In artistic depictions of dining, elbows tell their own story. In medieval paintings, they rest freely, part of a world still untroubled by etiquette. In Georgian and Victorian portraits, however, arms vanish into carefully arranged poses, as if painters feared the wrath of Miss Manners herself. When elbows do appear, it's usually in satirical prints, caricatures mocking the nouveau riche, who had wealth but not the grace to keep their limbs under control. Nothing said social climber quite like leaning on the table while pretending to discuss poetry. The church even joined the war. Sermons in the 18th and 19th centuries occasionally used table manners as metaphors for moral virtue, equating self-restraint in posture with self-restraint in spirit. Preachers warned that bad habits at the dinner table led to worse ones elsewhere. In other words, elbows today, moral collapse tomorrow. Dinner, it seemed, was a gateway sin. The policing of elbows also revealed something deeper. Society's fear of relaxation. To rest one's elbows meant surrendering to comfort. And comfort was dangerous. It blurred the boundaries between decorum and desire. It suggested you were too at ease, too human, perhaps too real. Etiquette, at its core, existed to suppress the natural in favour of the artificial, to turn eating, a primal act, into a performance of order. The elbow was simply too honest for that theatre. By the late Victorian period, the rule began to soften, slightly. As industrial life grew more exhausting and family dinners replaced grand banquets, practicality began to creep back in. People still knew the rule, of course, but they began to ignore it in private. Public dinners remained rigid, but at home, the occasional elbow found mercy. Manuals adapted, advising that one might rest the forearm lightly when conversing, but never when eating. It was a small step towards sanity, or perhaps the first sign that society was finally too tired to keep pretending. The irony is that elbows were never truly the problem. They were scapegoats for the universal human truth that nobody can sit perfectly composed forever. The war on elbows was the war on fatigue, fidgeting, and being human. It was society's attempt to erase the physical reality of existence, and as long as dinner tables existed, people kept losing that battle. So next time someone scolds you for leaning forward or resting an elbow, remember, you're not being rude. You're carrying on a long tradition of quiet defiance against centuries of absurdity. Because in the grand story of etiquette, your elbows were never the villains, they were the revolutionaries, bravely seating or resting against the tyranny of table manners. Soup became the ultimate civility test, slurping was scandal, sipping was salvation. Of all the foods ever invented to torment the anxious diner, soup reigned supreme. It was the great equalizer of etiquette. No matter how wealthy, refined, or practiced you were, one wrong movement with the spoon could turn you into a social cautionary tale. Humour. One loud slurp and you'd be socially executed by spoon. For centuries, soup wasn't just a dish, it was a ritual. It represented warmth, hospitality, and more importantly, danger. Because when liquid food met delicate manners, chaos was never far behind. The upper classes treated soup not as a meal, but as a moral test disguised as consommé. Everything about it, the way it was served, the way it was held, the way it was consumed, was a minefield. In the medieval and Tudor eras, soup, or pottage as it was called, was simple, thick, and communal. You didn't need a spoon, a piece of bread, or the occasional wooden ladle did the job. But as refinement spread through Europe, soup evolved from hearty survival food into a refined art. By the 17th century, France had turned it into a liquid symbol of civilization. The spoon replaced the trencher, and the act of eating soup gracefully became a mark of your breeding. Anyone could hold a sword, but only a true gentleman could hold a spoon without humiliating himself. The rules for soup etiquette became almost scientific. First came the posture: sit straight, shoulders back, never lean too close to the bowl, because proximity suggested desperation. Next, the grip: hold the spoon between thumb and forefinger, delicately, never like a shovel. The motion was crucial: scoop the soup away from you, not toward. This counterintuitive rule was meant to prove restraint. After all, civilization was built on making simple things unnecessarily difficult. And then came the silence, the hardest rule of all. The sound of slurping was considered one of the worst crimes against politeness. It wasn't just frowned upon, it was moral failure rendered audible. In an age obsessed with composure, the sudden eruption of a slurp was like a cannon blast in church. One etiquette guide from 1847 gravely warned, "Let the soup glide noiselessly into the mouth. The least sound brings shame." Another declared, "The man who slurps his soup is unfit for society." Imagine that, one wrong sip, and you're banished from humanity. But silence came with risk. Without slurping, how did one avoid burning one's tongue on a boiling broth? The manuals didn't care. Pain, apparently, was preferable to impropriety. Diners were expected to wait patiently, blowing gently if needed, but discreetly. Blowing too obviously suggested impatience. It was better to scorch your mouth than reveal haste. The ideal diner suffered in silence, smiling serenely as their taste buds died for the cause of civility. Even the bowl itself became part of the choreography. One never tilted it toward oneself. That was barbaric, but instead tilted away. Why? Because refinement, it seemed, required geometry. The act of tilting the bowl away proved you were above hunger, above need, above gravity itself. You weren't eating soup, you were performing restraint. The danger didn't end there. Soup was often the first course at formal dinners, meaning it served as the opening act of judgment. Guests had only minutes to demonstrate grace under pressure, while everyone else pretended not to watch. A trembling hand could send a golden consommé cascading down one's waistcoat. A misplaced spoon might clatter like a death knell. The anxiety was so intense that one Victorian diarist described soup as the enemy of dignity. The spoon itself was another social weapon. In early centuries, spoons were status symbols, often made of silver, gold, or even mother of pearl. The poor used wood or pewter, but the rich dined from shining metal, engraved with family crests. Yet with wealth came pressure. If your spoon touched the bowl, you'd made noise. If it clinked against your teeth, you were a savage. Some guests practiced their technique privately before grand dinners, dipping imaginary spoons into invisible broth, rehearsing the angle like fencing students. Soup, it turned out, was a duel, fought quietly and with napkins. The Victorians, of course, raised the anxiety to near religious levels. Etiquette books of the 19th century devoted pages, sometimes chapters, to the proper conduct of soup. They prescribed every detail: never break bread directly into the soup, never ask what's in it, and under no circumstances make eye contact while spooning. The dining room became a battlefield of concentration. Even Queen Victoria was said to eat soup in near silence, as if the entire British Empire depended on it, and heaven help you if you sneezed. Soup was notorious for its timing. The heat, the aroma, the pepper, all conspired to produce sneezes at the worst possible moment. But sneezing mid-course was a disaster. One etiquette guide solution: if you must sneeze, withdraw swiftly and with humility. Essentially, you were to evacuate the battlefield and hope no one noticed. Still, for all its dangers, soup remained a symbol of refinement. It was delicate, luxurious, and beautifully useless, the kind of food that required servants, silver, and patience. A steaming tureen arriving at the table was a spectacle, a declaration that the household had achieved peak civilization. Even when railways were spreading and factories belched smoke, the genteel classes clung to their soup spoons as though civilization itself would collapse without them. Ironically, in other parts of the world, slurping was a compliment. In Japan and China, the act signified appreciation and enthusiasm, proof that you enjoyed the meal. But European diners saw it as the height of barbarism, proof that one's soul had yet to be tamed by etiquette. The cultural divide was so strong that 19th century travellers wrote entire essays marvelling and faintly judging the sound of others enjoying their noodles. Apparently to the Western elite, joy was as uncivilised as noise. By the 20th century, the strictest rules began to soften. Soup remained a formal dish, but the terror eased slightly. People started laughing off small clinks and subtle slurps, though never at royal tables. Still, the ghosts of past etiquette lingered. To this day, people instinctively scoop away, tilt the bowl just so and pretend not to worry about making noise. Civilization, it seems, has long memories. So the next time you lift your spoon, remember, you're participating in one of history's oldest endurance tests. Soup has always been more than food. It's an exam in liquid form. The good news, you're unlikely to be exiled for slurping. The bad news, someone, somewhere is still silently judging you for it. Women faced impossible expectations of grace, restraint, and decorative silence. The dinner table, for all its silverware and civility, was one of the most finely tuned stages of gender inequality in history. Here, women were expected to shine, but only just enough to illuminate the men beside them. They were ornaments of elegance, conversation accessories, and moral mirrors reflecting the virtues of the age. Humour. A lady could faint from hunger, but never from bad manners. From the Renaissance to the late Victorian era, dining was as much about gender performance as it was about food. Every rule, every gesture, every breath at the table was different for men and women. For men, dinner was a theatre of dominance, where power was displayed through control, wit, and the occasional loud toast. For women, it was a test of restraint so delicate that even existing too loudly could be considered an offence. They weren't there to eat. They were there to be seen eating beautifully. In Tudor and Elizabethan courts, noblewomen were expected to embody refinement so extreme it bordered on suffering. They wore gowns tight enough to restrict breathing, sleeves long enough to catch fire, and headdresses so wide they couldn't turn to look at the person beside them. Eating under these conditions required both athletic precision and blind faith. Manuals advised women to take small, modest portions, chew quietly and smile at the right moments. Talking with food in one's mouth was unacceptable, but refusing food altogether risked offending the host. The safest choice was to nibble just enough to seem polite. While praying, no one noticed the growing pile of untouched meat on your plate. By the 18th century, things hadn't improved much, only evolved into subtler forms of control. Georgian dining rooms glittered with chandeliers and conversation, but behind the sparkle was a web of expectations that defined femininity in terms of fragility. A lady's appetite was supposed to be as dainty as her waist. To show hunger was to reveal animal need, and need was unseemly. Women were praised for their light appetites, which was convenient, since corsets made deep breathing and therefore deep eating impossible. It's no wonder fainting became fashionable. Sometimes it was the only socially acceptable way to digest. Even the way a woman held her utensils was scrutinised. Forks were to be handled delicately, never clenched, and knives used only for cutting small, unthreatening portions. A lady who stabbed her steak too aggressively risked being labelled coarse or masculine. Elbows were, of course, forbidden, and posture was everything. Sitting straight wasn't merely polite, it was moral. A slouching woman was suspected of moral weakness. The table was her battlefield, and posture her armour. Conversation, too, was a minefield. Women were expected to speak but not dominate, to charm but not challenge. Their role was to keep the atmosphere pleasant, which meant smoothing over awkward silences or pretending not to hear offensive remarks. A witty woman might earn admiration if she was careful, but too much wit, especially at a man's expense, was dangerous. One misplaced remark and she became improper, or worse, difficult. Entire etiquette guides warned women against cleverness at table. As one 19th century author put it with chilling sincerity, let her laughter be soft, her voice lower than her husband's, and her thoughts lighter than the meal. Even leaving the table was a ritual of hierarchy. At grand dinners, women rose before the men, signalling that the serious part of the evening, meaning politics, brandy and bragging, could now begin. The ladies retired to the drawing room to sip tea, gossip, or play the piano while the men drank themselves into eloquence. It was one of society's most quietly humiliating traditions. The physical embodiment of how femininity was treated, decorative, disciplined, and politely excluded from power. In lower and middle-class homes, the rules were no less punishing, only less gilded. Housewives managed meals but rarely sat to enjoy them properly. They hovered, serving everyone else first, ensuring their husband's comfort, and often eating whatever was left. In working-class families, women's behaviour at the table reflected not etiquette manuals but survival itself. Serving, clearing, and stretching meals so no one went hungry. Yet even here, they were judged. A proper wife kept her husband fed and her mouth shut. As the Victorian age dawned, etiquette metastasized. Entire libraries of books were written on how women should behave at dinner. Titles like The Polite Lady's Guide to Table Deportment or Grace at Supper. The moral conduct of the feminine diner taught that good manners were not just social tools, they were proof of virtue. Women who broke etiquette weren't simply rude, they were sinful. The moral panic over female behaviour extended even to food choice. Certain dishes were unladylike, anything too messy, too spicy, or requiring visible effort. A lady might sip broth, nibble fruit, or delicately fork at fish, but she never devoured meat. Appetite, like opinion, had to be suppressed. And yet, within this suffocating system, women found ways to rebel. The drawing rooms they were exiled to became breeding grounds for quiet revolution. Here, freed from male scrutiny, they exchanged gossip, ideas, and eventually politics. By the late 19th century, suffragettes were meeting over tea and biscuits, ironically turning the rituals of feminine dining into instruments of defiance. If men claimed the dining room as their arena of authority, women claimed the parlour as theirs and began plotting to upend the entire table. There's an unspoken irony in how history remembers these scenes. Paintings and novels show women as serene, graceful, and delicate, their hands poised and faces tranquil. What they don't show is the hunger, the real physical hunger beneath the lace and etiquette. They don't show the mental math of survival, how to appear perfect while starving for equality. Behind every softly folded napkin was a quiet act of endurance. By the early 20th century, as social reform and women's rights movements gained strength, the dinner table became one of many battlefields in the larger war over gender roles. Some rules slowly broke. Women began to drink wine openly, to speak more freely, even to remain at the table after dessert. But the old ghosts of etiquette lingered. Even today, echoes of those expectations survive in phrases like ladylike, in the notion that politeness is inherently feminine and authority inherently male. So the next time someone tells you to mind your manners, remember the long line of women who were forced to perform grace while the world watched and judged. Their restraint built the illusion of civility, even as it starved them of freedom. The truth is, they weren't delicate. They were disciplined beyond belief. They could hold their tongues, their posture, and their fury all at once, because in the grand history of dinner, men got to carve the roast. But women carved civilization itself, politely, of course, and with perfect posture. Mass-produced china and silver allowed the middle class to mimic aristocracy. The Industrial Revolution didn't just transform factories and cities, it also invaded the dining room. Suddenly, civility itself could be manufactured, packaged, and sold. What had once been the exclusive privilege of nobles, porcelain, silver, crystal, could now be found in homes of clerks, merchants, and anyone with ambition and a steady income. It was the democratization of dinner, or more accurately, the democratization of pretending to be rich. Humour. At last, everyone could pretend to be upper class, at least until the soup hit the carpet. Before the 18th century, tableware was an unmistakable indicator of wealth. Nobles dined off fine porcelain imported from China, silver cutlery engraved with family crests, and crystal goblets that glimmered like jewels under candlelight. The middle and lower classes, meanwhile, made do with wood, pewter or clay. But the Industrial Revolution changed everything. New manufacturing techniques meant plates, utensils and glassware could be mass-produced with startling precision. A world that had once eaten from rough pottery now dined from the glittering illusion of refinement. Factories like Wedgwood, Spode and Royal Doulton led the charge in Britain, perfecting the art of mass-producing elegance. Josiah Wedgwood, a marketing genius ahead of his time, realised that people didn't just want dishes, they wanted status. He sold not just china, but aspiration. His famous Queen's Ware, endorsed by Queen Charlotte herself, became the 18th century equivalent of a luxury brand collaboration. Suddenly middle-class families could sit down to dinner surrounded by the same patterns as royalty. Of course, the difference was that aristocrats used servants to wash their china, while the middle class often broke theirs trying to imitate them. The rise of affordable silverware was equally transformative. Thanks to industrial metal casting and electroplating, even modest households could own sets of shining cutlery. What had once required generations of wealth could now be acquired through catalogue order. For the newly prosperous middle class, silver became a symbol of victory, tangible proof that they'd made it, or at least looked like they had. The result was a kind of social arms race, where neighbours competed over who could host the most refined dinner party, complete with matching utensils and the latest imported china pattern. But with new tableware came new anxiety. The problem with owning symbols of refinement is that you were expected to know how to use them. The 19th century saw an explosion of etiquette manuals catering to the nervous middle classes. Titles like The Polite Companion to the Dinner Table and Household Manners for the Aspiring Gentleman sold by the thousands. They explained in painstaking detail which spoon to use, how to hold a knife like a gentleman, and how not to terrify one's guests by serving soup in a teacup. These books didn't just teach manners, they offered a roadmap to social survival. Table design itself became a matter of engineering. As new wealth flooded in, dining tables grew larger and more elaborate, complete with extendable sections, intricate carving, and secret compartments for silver. The introduction of the service à la Russe style, serving meals in sequential courses rather than all at once, demanded an arsenal of dishes, bowls, and serving utensils. Factories churned them out, and households scrambled to keep up. Suddenly dinner was no longer a meal. It was a logistical operation requiring multiple forks, 5 glasses, and the patience of a saint. The irony was that while industrialization simplified production, it complicated behaviour. Where once a family might have eaten stew from a shared pot, now they had to navigate porcelain pyramids and matching glassware without cracking either. Servants had to learn the precise placement of each item, while hosts learned the art of pretending it had always been that way. The new middle class lived in constant fear of looking provincial, or worse, breaking something they couldn't afford to replace. As one 1856 etiquette book warned, better no dinner at all than a dinner served with confusion. Translation: if you can't do it perfectly, don't invite anyone. Manufacturers capitalised on this anxiety. Wedgwood advertised his china as impervious to vulgarity, while silver companies promised that their electroplated wares would elevate even the humblest meal. It was marketing genius and cultural manipulation. Every plate sold was a promise of refinement, every fork an investment in self-respect. Dining had become theatre, and tableware the set design. Yet despite the pretense, the Industrial Revolution did bring genuine beauty into ordinary homes. The artistry of ceramics flourished. Designs once reserved for palaces, neoclassical motifs, floral garlands, delicate gilding, appeared on tables across Europe. Factories employed armies of artists and decorators, turning industrial output into artistry. The dining room became a museum of affordability, where elegance was no longer inherited but purchased by the piece. Still, not everyone approved of this new accessibility. The old aristocracy sneered at factory finery, claiming it lacked authenticity. True refinement, they said, couldn't be bought. An argument that conveniently ignored the centuries they'd spent doing exactly that. But for the ambitious middle class, imitation was power. They embraced their porcelain and polished forks with pride. Dinner became their battlefield of respectability, a place to prove that they belonged in a world that had long kept them out. And of course, with all that glittering tableware came disaster. China shattered, silver tarnished, and glassware cracked in the heat of nervous performance. There are countless accounts of dinner parties derailed or derailed by accidents. Guests fainting from stress, soup spilling onto new tablecloths, servants slipping on freshly waxed floors. One poor hostess reportedly wept for an hour after her husband dropped a gravy boat from their new Royal Dalton service. Etiquette dictated she forgive him, but one suspects she didn't. The industrial dining revolution reshaped not just how people ate, but how they saw themselves. It blurred the line between authenticity and performance, between aspiration and anxiety. A middle-class home might have looked aristocratic, but beneath the polished silver lay a heartbeat of fear of judgment, of breaking form, of being caught pretending. Yet, in a strange way, this performance of civility laid the foundation for modern manners. Today's dinner sets, matching cutlery and dinner party etiquette, all descend from that 19th century moment when technology met aspiration. Industrialization didn't just mechanize dining, it mechanized identity. So next time you sit down at a table gleaming with matching plates and polished utensils, raise a quiet toast to the anonymous factory workers and frantic hosts who made it all possible. They turned refinement from a birthright into a commodity, and in doing so gave everyone the chance to look elegant, if only until the soup hit the carpet. As etiquette spread globally, dining became a symbol of civilization and imperial conquest. The fork, the knife, and the napkin, once humble tools of European decorum, became instruments of empire, carried abroad not just as utensils, but as evidence of superiority. Across colonies from India to Africa to Southeast Asia, Europeans exported not only their armies, but their table manners, convinced that the ability to eat soup silently was proof of moral authority. Humour. Nothing says diplomacy like eating with 3 forks in a land without spoons. During the Great Age of Empire, the dinner table became an unlikely battlefield for the cultural domination. For colonizers, dining was diplomacy in miniature, a ritual that reinforced hierarchy, demanded imitation, and justified control. The British, French, Dutch, and Spanish didn't just bring guns and trade routes, they brought cutlery, tablecloths, and the unshakable belief that good manners equaled good morals. To dine properly was to prove one's civilization. To eat differently was to prove one's inferiority. Nowhere was this clearer than in the British Empire. Victorian colonials recreated England's dining rituals with obsessive zeal, no matter how absurd the setting. In the sweltering heat of India, colonial officers still dressed for dinner in starched collars and wool suits, candles melting faster than the guests. Servants fanned flies away from roast beef while British officials debated the proper temperature of claret. Etiquette manuals followed them across the seas, small leather-bound Bibles of refinement, instructing expats to maintain dignity, even as their puddings collapsed in the tropical humidity. For the British, the dinner table was a declaration of dominance, a portable palace of nobility amid the chaos of foreign lands. Tea services gleamed on rattan verandas, silver spoons clinked in china cups. Local cooks were trained to replicate British roasts and puddings with ingredients they'd never seen before. The resulting dishes were often culinary tragedies, but etiquette dictated praise. Guests smiled bravely through every curdled custard, because complaining would be more barbaric than the food itself. Meanwhile, colonized peoples found themselves pulled into this theatre of manners, sometimes willingly, sometimes under duress. Local elites who wished to gain favour with colonial rulers learned to dine the European way. In India, princely courts adopted silver cutlery and formal table service to signal sophistication. In West Africa, colonial administrators hosted banquets where guests were expected to eat in silence, with forks instead of fingers. And in Southeast Asia, European etiquette collided with long-standing traditions, where communal dining and shared plates were symbols of unity, something the colonizers saw as primitive. The irony? Those same Europeans would later romanticize family-style dining back home. To the imperial mind, controlling how people ate was almost as important as controlling what they ate. Missionaries taught dining etiquette alongside religion. Schools in colonies across Africa and Asia held lessons on table discipline, how to sit, how to chew, and above all how to avoid the sins of noise and enthusiasm. Local customs were dismissed as unrefined. Eating with one's hands became a marker of savagery, even though it had been practiced hygienically for millennia. The colonial fork, polished and pointed, became both symbol and weapon, the spear of civilization. But dining was also a form of subtle resistance. In many colonies, locals played the etiquette game strategically, adopting the manners but mocking them privately. Guests might politely mimic British table settings, only to serve dishes so spicy that even the most stoic colonial governor sweated through his cravat. In India, hosts began adding local twists to traditional British meals, turning the conqueror's rituals into a culinary trap. Roast chicken with curry gravy and mango chutney sandwiches became ironic favourites, dishes that smiled politely while biting back. The French Empire, of course, took a different approach. Where the British treated dinner as discipline, the French treated it as cultural seduction. French colonial officials in places like Vietnam and North Africa introduced their cuisine as an art form. Croissants, pâté, fine wine, convincing themselves they were elevating local palates. They built cafes in Hanoi and Algiers, where elegance was both weapon and advertisement. Dining became diplomacy by deliciousness. Yet beneath the flaky pastry layers lay the same message: our way is superior and yours must adapt. The table thus became a mirror of empire itself, outwardly gracious, inwardly controlling. Every detail reinforced hierarchy. The head of the table, of course, belonged to the European official. Local guests, even princes or ministers, sat lower in rank, symbolically placed beneath the empire's appetite. Servants, often natives, moved silently, trained to the rhythms of European service, their own traditions erased from the performance. A spilled drop of wine could draw more scorn than an entire village uprising. Even the architecture of dining rooms reflected imperial ideology. In colonial mansions, long mahogany tables stretched like empires in miniature, polished surfaces of order amid the tropical wild. Imported chandeliers hung above, casting light on European faces and shadow on everyone else. It was civilization, illuminated, and exclusion quite literally left in the dark. But for all the pomp, cracks appeared. The daily absurdities of enforcing etiquette in foreign climates made colonial dining an exercise in farce. Butter melted before reaching the table. Soup curdled in the heat. Mosquitoes hovered over crystal glasses. One British officer in Burma famously noted in his diary, "Our dinner party was excellent, save for the frogs leaping into the punch bowl." Yet etiquette required him to pretend nothing was amiss. Civilization, it seemed, depended on the ability to ignore amphibians in your beverage. When the colonial age began to wane in the 20th century, its dining habits left deep marks. Tea became a global ritual. Silverware replaced traditional utensils in many parts of the world. The idea of proper dining, individual plates, multiple courses, silent chewing became the unspoken standard of modernity. The empire dissolved, but its table manners remained, baked into the global language of respectability. And yet, the world slowly pushed back. Post-colonial societies began reclaiming their own dining traditions, proudly eating with hands, sharing from bowls, embracing sound, spice, and authenticity. The fork lost its throne. What was once condemned as barbaric became celebrated as cultural. The dinner table, once a symbol of empire, became a site of reclamation. Looking back, it's hard not to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Empires rising and falling over forks and teacups. The colonizers believed they were spreading refinement, but what they really spread was insecurity, a centuries-long anxiety about how to eat correctly. And in the end, the most powerful act of rebellion wasn't war or politics. It was a simple one, a hand reaching for food without apology. Public dining introduced new anxieties, tipping, ordering and pronouncing French dishes. What began as a revolutionary idea, paying someone else to cook and serve your food, quickly evolved into one of the most stressful social experiences of modern life. In private, etiquette had been an art of control. In public, it became a spectacle of performance. The dinner table was no longer your domain. It was a stage, and the waiter, the menu, and every other diner were your audience. Humour. Nothing humbles the soul like mispronouncing hors d'oeuvres. Restaurants as we know them were born in 18th century France, where a Parisian chef named Boulanger reportedly opened a shop selling restoratives, small bowls of broth meant to restore health and spirit. From this modest beginning came a revolution in dining. The idea that you could walk into a public establishment, sit down, and be served food of your choice, no castle, no servants, no invitations required. It was culinary democracy with a side of panic. Because while the restaurant offered freedom from home-cooked monotony, it also required navigating a brand new social jungle of menus, manners, and invisible rules. For the first time, people from different walks of life dined in the same room. The aristocrat, the bourgeois, the artist, and the ambitious clerk could all find themselves seated within earshot of one another. Suddenly, dining wasn't just about food, it was about public image. How you ordered, how you behaved, and how you tipped could define your reputation. The restaurant became the great equalizer and the great anxiety machine. In early Parisian restaurants, etiquette was everything. Patrons had to learn the art of commanding attention without appearing rude. You couldn't simply shout, "Waiter!" That was barbaric. Instead, refined diners employed delicate gestures, subtle coughs, or the understated flick of a wrist. The goal was to summon service as though by divine will. Too forceful, and you were a brute. Too timid, and you'd starve before the soup arrived. The performance required poise, patience, and a saint's ability to pretend you weren't furious after waiting 40 minutes for your oysters. Then there was the menu, that formidable document of both opportunity and humiliation. Written entirely in French because civilization apparently required confusion, menus offered dishes most diners couldn't pronounce, let alone identify. The uninitiated risked disaster. Ordering poulet à la Marengo confidently might earn you admiration, unless you pronounced it like poulet à la mango. Early restaurant goers often pointed at dishes silently, hoping to avoid linguistic exposure. Others relied on waiters' mercy, though this too was risky. The wrong question, "What's a consommé?" could earn a sneer that lingered in your soul. And then came tipping, that uniquely modern form of emotional extortion disguised as gratitude. In aristocratic dining halls, servants were paid poorly by the household, but in restaurants, customers were expected to contribute to the servant's livelihood. A revolutionary concept that inspired both generosity and resentment. By the 19th century, the rule of thumb had formed. Tip enough to seem genteel, but not so much that you look desperate. The line between stingy and showy was razor thin, and entire etiquette guides emerged to navigate it. One Victorian critic called tipping the tax on social insecurity. He wasn't wrong. The Industrial Revolution made restaurants accessible to the rising middle class, and with it came a new obsession: respectability in public. Dining became a rehearsal for upward mobility. Couples practiced their posture, studied menus in advance, and rehearsed polite laughter for the maitre d'. The restaurant was the modern salon, part theatre, part confessional, part social trap. There was even a proper way to enter one. Men walked slightly ahead to secure the table, while women followed gracefully, pretending not to be freezing because men had invented fashion without considering fabric. By the late 19th century, fine dining had spread to London, New York and beyond. Each city adapted the ritual with its own flair. In London, formality ruled and even fish knives had etiquette. In New York, swagger replaced subtlety. Diners flaunted wealth through champagne orders and volume. A New York critic in 1892 remarked that the restaurant is the new ballroom, where one dances with food instead of feet. It wasn't far off. Dining in public had become a performance of charm, confidence, and above all, restraint. Of course, mistakes were inevitable. Forks clattered, soup was slurped, and foreign words were mangled beyond salvation. The fear of embarrassment haunted every course. Even celebrated figures weren't immune. Mark Twain once admitted that he avoided ordering anything French because the tongue is no match for their spelling. Others faked sophistication through improvisation, sniffing wine they didn't understand, pretending to detect oakiness in tap water, or nodding sagely at menus while secretly panicking inside. Restaurants also blurred class boundaries in uncomfortable ways. The wealthy could still dine in private rooms or at exclusive clubs, but the middle classes flooded into brasseries and cafes, eager to imitate refinement. The result was a delicate dance of imitation. Waiters, often far more worldly than their patrons, became gatekeepers of dignity. They could make or break a customer's evening with a raised eyebrow. A polite "very good, monsieur" was a blessing. A silent smirk was a social death sentence. The power dynamic was reversed. The served had become the judged. Meanwhile, women's presence in restaurants marked a seismic cultural shift. In the early 19th century, respectable women rarely dined in public unless chaperoned. Restaurants were associated with taverns, and taverns with trouble, but by the late Victorian period, the emergence of tea rooms, hotel dining halls, and department store cafes created spaces where women could dine respectably, sometimes even alone. These spaces became quiet revolutions of independence, where women could eat without male supervision, talk politics over pastry, and pretend not to notice the scandalized stares of passers-by. The 20th century brought new layers of etiquette chaos. The rise of the waiter-sommelier dynamic introduced the terrifying ritual of wine selection. The wrong bottle could ruin your reputation, your wallet, and your evening. Meanwhile, American-style diners and cafeterias democratized eating even further. No silver, no servants, no shame. Yet for the refined, this informality was a crisis. The old rules collapsed. Was it acceptable to eat soup with a coffee spoon? Could one talk while chewing? Suddenly everyone was guessing, and etiquette experts scrambled to keep up. But for all its anxieties, the restaurant represented a fundamental shift in human civilization. The act of dining had escaped the home. It became a social institution, a marketplace of manners where individuality collided with performance. In restaurants, people reinvented themselves. A clerk could feel like a king, a poet could dine beside a banker, and both could pretend to understand crème brûlée. So yes, restaurants democratized dining, but they also gave birth to a new kind of social dread, the fear of being seen eating incorrectly. Still, amid the clinking glasses and whispered judgments, something remarkable happened. People learned to share space, to perform civility among strangers, to transform a simple meal into collective theatre. Today, when you squint at a foreign menu, fumble with a tip, or nervously ask for the special without knowing what it is, you're part of that grand tradition. You're not just eating, you're participating in the centuries-old drama of public dining. The good news, nobody's keeping score anymore. The bad news, the waiter probably is. 20th century dining relaxed traditions, replacing ceremony with convenience. After centuries of balancing spoons, memorizing fork hierarchies, and fearing social annihilation over soup, humanity finally decided enough was enough. The Industrial Revolution had made refinement affordable, but the 20th century made it exhausting. The new mantra wasn't eat properly, but just eat. Humour, forks were optional, sanity was restored. The 1900s opened with the last gasp of old-world dining grandeur. In Edwardian mansions and upper-class hotels, etiquette still ruled with silver-plated precision. Men stood when women entered, servants moved like silent ghosts, and dinner stretched through 12 courses of carefully choreographed cutlery. But outside those gilded dining rooms, the world was changing faster than manners could keep up. Cities were swelling, factories roaring, and people had less time than ever. The new age demanded efficiency, and table manners were about to go the way of the corset. World War I was the first great disruptor. With men at the front and women running households, the formality of dining simply collapsed. Family dinners became quick, pragmatic, and portable. Elaborate etiquette was replaced by practicality. Wartime rationing didn't pair well with multiple forks. You couldn't stage a 7-course meal when the 7th course was bread again. As households simplified, so did manners. The act of eating became about nourishment, not performance. The world was too busy surviving to worry about the correct angle of a spoon. The interwar years brought the restaurant revolution to the masses. Cafes, diners, and department store tea rooms turned eating into a public pastime. Gone were the aristocratic dining halls, in came the checkered tables, jukeboxes, and casual chatter. Middle-class families ate in public without fear of handle. People called waiters instead of summoning them with discreet coughs. And for the first time, dining out was entertainment, a social escape, not a social exam. Etiquette experts tried to adapt, publishing advice like how to behave in a tea room, but most people simply ignored them. Once you've eaten soup from a counter stool, there's no going back to crystal goblets. Then came World War II, and with it, total democratization of dining. Wartime canteens fed soldiers and civilians alike in efficient, no-nonsense fashion. Trays replaced tablecloths. Portions replaced courses. Everyone ate what they were given, when they were given it. The only etiquette rule that mattered was don't complain. When peace returned, nobody wanted to return to fussy old rituals. Dinner was now about comfort, community, and convenience. The silver spoon had lost its shine, literally and symbolically. By the 1950s, the invention of the television dinner sealed the fate of formality. The dining table, once the throne of civilization, was dethroned by the glowing screen. People ate from metal trays on laps, mesmerized by sitcoms and news anchors. It was the birth of casual dining, though critics at the time called it the moral collapse of the fork. Gone were the days of posture, napkin folding, and conversation. Now, etiquette meant not talking during I Love Lucy. The rise of fast food in the 1960s turned the revolution into a sprint. Drive-ins, diners, and burger chains championed speed over ceremony. For the first time, it was acceptable, even fashionable, to eat with your hands. The horror of slurping, chewing, or licking fingers gave way to ketchup-stained freedom. The golden arches replaced gilded mirrors. Paper replaced porcelain. The fork had officially lost the war to the French fry. It were messy, cheap, and glorious. Still, not everyone embraced the chaos. Traditionalists lamented the decline of manners, publishing desperate etiquette guides warning of a barbaric future. But the world had changed irrevocably. The feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s further dismantled the gendered rituals of dining. Women no longer sat quietly at dinner while men pontificated. They worked, they led, and they ate where they pleased, often standing over the sink at 10 p.m. after a long day, which was somehow more honest than centuries of pretending to enjoy boiled mutton. Technology soon joined the feast. Microwaves arrived, promising a meal in minutes. Convenience foods multiplied, frozen lasagna, instant soup, TV snacks, transforming the kitchen into a laboratory of speed. The dining room, once the soul of the home, became an architectural afterthought. Builders began designing smaller tables, fewer chairs, and eventually open-plan spaces where people could eat, talk, and live all at once. The once sacred dinner ritual dissolved into everyday life. By the late 20th century, the rules of dining had fractured entirely. The counterculture of the 1970s rejected stuffy traditions. Communal meals, potlucks, and picnics celebrated informality. Food wasn't a weapon of status anymore. It was a language of freedom. Eating cross-legged on the floor, serving buffet style, or grabbing takeout became symbols of authenticity. A new form of etiquette emerged, not about formality, but about consideration. You didn't need to know which fork to use. You just needed to pass the bread politely. The global spread of cuisine further dismantled the old hierarchy of manners. Sushi demanded chopsticks. Tacos required hands. Ethiopian injera replaced plates entirely. Western dining norms no longer ruled the world, they joined it. The modern diner became a cultural shapeshifter, navigating noodles one day and fondue the next. Flexibility replaced formality. The new golden rule? When in doubt, follow the locals. Of course, with freedom came confusion. Without the old rules, people began inventing new ones. Should you post your meal on social media before eating it? Is it rude to text during dinner? Or is that just modern multitasking? The 21st century introduced etiquette's strangest paradox. We became more relaxed than ever, and yet more self-conscious. Now, instead of fearing the disapproval of dukes and duchesses, we fear the silent judgment of Instagram. Still, despite the chaos, something profound was gained. When the rules collapsed, dining became human again. People could eat together without fear of failure. Meals became conversations, not performances. Hospitality shifted from precision to warmth. And while the ghosts of etiquette still linger, the polite warning of elbows off the table, the memory of formal dining halls, most people today prefer a good laugh and a shared pizza to a flawless display of manners. So yes, forks became optional, napkins went missing, and formal dinners turned into takeout nights. But the collapse of the old rules wasn't the end of civility, it was its rebirth. For the first time in centuries, dining wasn't about who you were or what you owned, but about who you were with. The good news? You don't need a manual. The bad news? You might still burn your microwave lasagna. Ancient etiquette still lingers today, from don't talk with your mouth full to dining selfies. Centuries of dinner table anxiety may have faded, but the ghosts of etiquette haven't left. They've just traded lace cuffs for touchscreen phones. We like to think we've outgrown the tyranny of table manners, yet every time someone clinks a glass, reaches across the table, or debates whether to post a photo of their meal before eating it, history peeks over our shoulder. Humour. We may have conquered etiquette panic, but we still fear being judged by our salad fork. Modern dining, for all its casual comfort, still hums with echoes of the past. The fork, once denounced as the devil's prong, is now a global staple. Napkins may no longer be sculpted into swans, but we still feel a flicker of guilt when we forget to use one. Even the rule "don't talk with your mouth full" is a linguistic fossil from centuries when speaking mid-chew was a moral failure. The setting may have changed, fluorescent cafe lighting instead of candlelit halls, but the underlying fear of judgment remains intact. We've simply swapped the glares of Victorian matrons for the likes and comments of online spectators. If medieval dinner was a performance of survival and Victorian dinner a panic attack in slow motion, modern dining is a balancing act between authenticity and awareness. We may have banished most of the cutlery hierarchies, but new forms of etiquette have emerged, unspoken, ever-changing, and just as absurd. Take, for instance, the silent social contract of restaurant behaviour. Whisper too softly and the waiter ignores you. Speak too loudly and the couple beside you despises you. Order something unusual and you're pretentious. Order something basic and you're boring. Even choosing sparkling water can feel like an audition for a personality type. Technology, of course, has created a brand new battlefield. Once people panicked over which knife to use. Now, they panic over whether it's rude to photograph their food before taking the first bite. Some claim it's artful documentation, others call it modern gluttony. But the truth is, it's just another form of table performance. Where once we displayed refinement through posture and precision, we now display it through filters and captions. The dining room has simply moved to the digital stage. The perfect meal no longer impresses the host, it impresses the algorithm. And yet, despite all the technological noise, the emotional core of etiquette endures, the desire to belong. Humans have always feared social rejection more than indigestion. Whether it's avoiding slurps in 18th century Paris or avoiding chewing noises in a Zoom lunch meeting, the instinct is the same. Don't embarrass yourself in front of others. Modern life may be freer, but it's not pressure-free. The settings have changed, but the stakes, acceptance, respect, and the illusion of composure remain hauntingly familiar. Even family dinners today echo ancient rituals. Parents correct their children. Sit up straight. Use your napkin. Chew quietly, without realizing they're passing down customs born in medieval great halls and Georgian parlours. Every elbows off the table is a whisper from a time when leaning forward meant disrespect. Every say thank you before you eat stems from a world where blessings over bread doubled as social insurance. Our domestic manners are relics of survival instincts disguised as politeness. And though the world no longer dines under the gaze of kings, we've replaced royal scrutiny with something arguably worse: self-awareness. The etiquette of the past demanded obedience to authority. The etiquette of today demands curation of identity. When you eat in public, whether in a restaurant or through an Instagram story, you're not just having dinner, you're presenting yourself. What was once grace has become brand. The salad fork may be gone, but the performance remains, just with better lighting and fewer feathers. Globalization has further reshaped how we define civility. The world's cuisines now mingle freely: chopsticks beside forks, tacos beside sushi, curries beside casseroles, and with them their manners have mixed too. What used to be considered improper has become trendy. Eating with your hands, once condemned as barbaric, is now celebrated as authentic in many cuisines. Slurping noodles, once scandalous, is applauded in ramen bars. We're slowly rediscovering that etiquette isn't universal, it's cultural. What's rude in one country is respectful in another. The world has grown smaller, and so thankfully has our snobbery. Still, certain habits refuse to die. The instinct to judge how others eat runs deep, a leftover reflex from the eras when table behaviour determined class, morality and worth. Watch a dinner party today and you'll see the same ancient theatre play out in modern costume. Someone inevitably critiques another's chewing. Someone else tries to out-recommend the wine. And someone, somewhere, uses the wrong fork, blissfully unaware that they've resurrected 1,000 years of dining drama in a single innocent motion. Even the rituals of politeness, toasting, thanking the host, waiting for everyone to be served, trace back to superstition and strategy. Toasting, for instance, began as a way to prove your drink wasn't poisoned. Waiting to eat ensured your food wasn't cursed or inferior. We still perform these rituals, stripped of their original paranoia, but heavy with inherited symbolism. The past hides in plain sight, disguised as habit. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy of dinner warfare is its strange, beautiful outcome: connection. For all the absurd rules, table tensions, and social anxieties, the act of dining together remains one of humanity's most universal gestures of peace. We might have invented forks to judge each other, but we also invented them to share food. Every civilization, no matter how elaborate or chaotic, has found a way to turn eating into community, to transform necessity into ceremony. And though the rules may have softened, the purpose endures: to gather, to belong, to taste the world together. So yes, the days of balancing etiquette manuals on your lap are gone. We eat faster, talk louder, and spill more freely than our ancestors ever dared. But every time you pass the salt, raise a glass, or remind someone to chew with their mouth closed, you're echoing a history thousands of years old. We've tamed the terror of dinner decorum, but not the human need for dignity. The good news: the table is now open to everyone. The bad news: someone will still judge you for ordering pineapple on your pizza, the banquet is over, the rules are broken, and civilization somehow still remembers to pass the bread politely.